whispered, squeezing my fingers. I forced a smile, ignoring the way the air seemed to thicken in my lungs. Moving had been her idea. A fresh start after months of arguments about nothing and everything. The price had been suspiciously low, but the inspector found nothing wrong. No foundation issues, no mold, no structural damage. Just an old house that had sat empty for 3 years, waiting. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and arranging. I threw myself into the work, grateful for the distraction from that initial unease. But at night, when the house settled into darkness, I began to notice things. It started with the sounds. Not the typical creaks and groans of old wood. I expected those. These were different, deliberate, a rhythmic tapping inside the walls, always in sets of 3. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from behind the vintage wallpaper in the hallway. I'd press my ear against the surface, trying to locate the source, but the moment I did, the sound would migrate to another room, as if playing with me. My wife heard nothing. She slept soundly while I lay rigid beside her, counting the intervals between each set of taps, wondering if I was losing my mind. The balloon appeared on a Tuesday, red, perfectly inflated, hovering at eye level in the middle of our living room. No string attached, no visible means of suspension, just floating there, rotating slowly as if caught in an imperceptible current. I stood frozen in the doorway, coffee mug trembling in my hand. The liquid sloshed over the rim, scalding my fingers, but I couldn't look away. The balloon shouldn't exist. We had no parties, no celebrations. We didn't even own any balloons. "Honey?" I called out, my voice cracking. She appeared behind me, peering over my shoulder. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the balloon with a shaking finger, but when I looked again, it had drifted toward the hallway, bobbing gently as if beckoning us to follow. Without thinking, I moved after it, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The balloon maintained a steady distance, always just out of reach, leading me through the dining room, past the kitchen, toward the back stairs that led to the second floor. At the base of the stairs it paused. Then, impossibly, it passed through the closed door of the closet beneath the staircase. Not around it, not under it, through it. As if the solid wood was merely a suggestion, I yanked the door open. Empty, just coats and old boxes we hadn't unpacked yet. The balloon was gone. My wife found me there 20 minutes later, pulling everything out of the closet, searching behind boxes, running my hands along every surface. "What are you looking for?" she asked, concern etching lines around her eyes. I couldn't explain. How could I tell her about a balloon that defied physics? She already thought I was stressed from the move. That night, the pulling began. I woke at 3:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because the red digits of the alarm clock seemed to burn into my retinas. Something was wrong. My body felt displaced, as if invisible fingers had wrapped around my spine and were gently, insistently tugging me toward the door. I resisted, gripping the sheets, but the sensation intensified. Not painful, but deeply wrong, like my skeleton wanted to crawl out of my skin and walk away without me. The pull was specific, directional, toward the hallway, down the stairs, to somewhere in the bowels of the house I hadn't yet explored. Fighting against it was exhausting. Sweat soaked through my shirt as I held myself in place, muscles trembling with effort. My wife slept on, oblivious, her breathing deep and even. I wanted to wake her, to ask if she felt it too, but my throat had closed up, vocal cords paralyzed by a terror I couldn't name. The sensation lasted exactly 13 minutes. I knew because I watched every second tick by on the clock, using the numbers as an anchor to reality. When it finally released me, I collapsed back onto the mattress, gasping as if I'd been holding my breath the entire time. In the morning, bruises had formed along my ribs, perfect finger marks in purple and yellow, as if someone had gripped me from the inside. I started documenting everything: times, dates, locations, duration. The tapping continued its migration through the walls. The balloon reappeared randomly, sometimes in the bathroom, sometimes floating past the window from outside, always that same arterial red. And the pulling grew stronger each night. My wife noticed my notebook, found it tucked under my side of the mattress during her weekly changing of sheets. She confronted me in the kitchen, holding it like evidence of an affair. "What is this?" Her voice was careful, controlled. I tried to explain, showed her the entries, the patterns I'd discovered. The tapping followed a route through the house, always clockwise. The balloon appeared only when she wasn't home. The pulling intensified during the new moon. She looked at me with such pity that I wanted to scream. Instead, she suggested I see someone, talk to a professional about stress. She made an appointment for me. I didn't go. 3 weeks into our new life, I found the doll. I'd been investigating the master bedroom closet, trying to locate the source of a new sound, a soft scratching, like fingernails on wood. The closet was deep, with a strange alcove in the back that the previous owners had used for storage. As I pushed aside old garment bags and boxes, my flashlight beam caught something hanging from the rod. A porcelain doll, suspended by its own hair, which had been wrapped around the bar multiple times with deliberate precision. Its face was turned toward the wall, dress yellowed with age. The scratching sound was coming from its fingers, which twitched against the plaster in a rhythm I recognized. Tap, tap, tap. I reached up to touch it, and the moment my fingers made contact, the pulling sensation exploded through my body with violent intensity. But this time, I saw something. A flash of image burned into my mind. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing in this very closet. Her face was pale, eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't identify. Fear, anger, hunger. She mouthed a single word. Mine. I jerked backward, stumbling out of the closet, the vision dissipating like smoke. The doll continued its rhythmic scratching, and I slammed the door shut, pressing my back against it as if to barricade something inside. That evening, I tried one more time to explain to my wife. I brought her to the closet, opened the door with shaking hands. The doll was gone. No sign it had ever been there, except for tiny scratches in the plaster that could have been anything, could have been nothing. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with those pitying eyes, and went to bed early. I stopped sleeping. Instead, I wandered the house at night, following the sounds, tracking the balloon when it appeared, resisting the pull that grew more insistent with each passing hour. I discovered that certain rooms felt heavier than others, as if the air itself had gained mass. The dining room was the worst. Standing in its center felt like being at the bottom of the ocean, pressure crushing in from all sides. During one of these nocturnal explorations, I found myself in the basement. I hadn't been down there since the initial tour with the realtor. It was unfinished, just concrete and exposed beams. But in the far corner, I discovered something that made my blood crystallize. Scratches in the concrete floor, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all in sets of 3. And in the center of this scarred circle, a child's drawing, done in what looked like charcoal. It showed a house, our house, with stick figures inside, 3 of them, 2 adults and a smaller figure between them. But the smaller figure was drawn differently, with wild hair that seemed to float around its head and hollow circles for eyes. Below the drawing, in shaky letters, "Waiting." I ran upstairs, grabbed my phone to take a picture, but when I returned, the floor was clean, smooth concrete, no scratches, no drawing, just my reflection in a puddle of water that hadn't been there before. The next morning, my wife told me she was going to stay with her sister for a few days. "Just to give me space to rest," she said, "to get better." I nodded, unable to form words around the knot in my throat. Part of me wanted to beg her to stay, to not leave me alone with whatever inhabited these walls. Another part, a darker part I didn't want to acknowledge, was relieved. That first night alone, the house transformed. The tapping became a symphony, no longer confined to sets of 3, but evolving into complex rhythms that seemed to spell out messages in a code I couldn't crack. The balloon multiplied, 3 of them now, floating in formation through the rooms, passing through walls and doors, as if the physical laws of the universe were merely suggestions they chose to ignore. And the pulling became almost gentle, seductive even. Instead of yanking at my bones, it felt more like an invitation, a soft hand extended in the darkness. I found myself standing at the top of the stairs at 3:17 a.m., not remembering how I got there. The house hummed around me, a frequency I felt more than heard, vibrating through the soles of my feet and up into my chest. The air shimmered slightly, as if I were looking through water. That's when I saw her clearly for the first time. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, no more than 8 years old, wearing a dress that might have been white once, but had aged to the color of old bones. Her hair floated around her head as if she were underwater, and her eyes were just holes. Not empty sockets, but actual holes, through which I could see the wall behind her. She raised one small hand and beckoned. The pull intensified, and this time, I didn't resist. I took one step down, then another. Each footfall felt like sinking into thick liquid. The girl's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You're the one who stays." I paused mid-step, confusion cutting through the trance. "What?" She tilted her head, hair drifting with the motion. "They always leave, but one always stays. The house needs one to stay." I thought of my wife safely at her sister's house. Had the house chosen me? Or had I been chosen by default, the weaker one, the one already fracturing under the pressure of its attention? "I don't understand," I whispered. The girl smiled, and in that moment she looked almost normal, almost alive. "You will. You're already changing. Haven't you noticed?" I looked down at my hands. They seemed normal enough, but as I watched, they became slightly translucent, as if I were fading, or as if something else was showing through. Terror shot through me like ice water, breaking whatever spell held me. I stumbled backward up the stairs, away from the girl, away from the terrible understanding creeping into my mind. But even as I fled to the bedroom and barricaded the door with furniture, I could feel the truth settling into my bones. The house wasn't haunted, it was hungry, and I was being digested. The days blur together now, or maybe it's been weeks. Time moves strangely here, thick and slow like honey. My wife hasn't returned. Sometimes I forget what she looks like, and then remember with startling clarity. Her laugh, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous, the smell of her shampoo. I call her occasionally. The conversations are stilted, careful. She asks if I'm feeling better. I tell her yes. The house is quiet now, peaceful. It's not entirely a lie. The tapping has stopped, the balloons have disappeared, and the pulling sensation is gone, because I no longer need to be pulled. I go willingly now. Each night at 3:17 a.m. I meet the girl at the bottom of the stairs. She tells me stories about the others who lived here. The man who lasted 3 months before his family found him talking to the walls. The woman who filled notebook after notebook with drawings of eyes watching from inside the wood grain. The couple who swore their reflections moved independently in the mirrors. "But they all left," she says, her voice like wind through empty rooms. "They always leave, and then the house is hungry again." I understand now. The house doesn't want to harm anyone. It just needs company, someone to acknowledge it, to feed it attention, to become part of its breathing walls and whispering wood. The girl, I've started calling her Echo, though she never told me her name. She was the first. A child who played hide and seek in the closets and never came out. Or maybe she did come out, just different, transformed into something the house could keep. And now it's my turn. I can feel myself spreading through the structure, my consciousness seeping into the foundations. Sometimes I know things I shouldn't. When the mailman will arrive, what the neighbors are cooking for dinner, how many breaths my wife takes in her sleep at her sister's house 30 miles away. The boundary between me and the house grows thinner each day. Echo says it won't hurt when the transformation completes. She says it's like falling asleep in a warm bath, except you never wake up. Or rather, you wake up as something else, something more. Part of the house is dreaming. I've stopped eating, food tastes like sawdust anyway. Instead, I sustain myself on the house's energy, the thrumming power that runs through its bones. My reflection in the mirrors has started to fade, not disappearing exactly, but becoming translucent, layered, as if multiple versions of me exist simultaneously. Yesterday, or was it last week, I found myself in the basement without remembering the journey. My hands were covered in charcoal, and a new drawing had appeared on the concrete. This one showed 4 figures in the house, 2 adults, still stick figures, and 2 other shapes that were harder to define, shadows with eyes. I think my wife is coming back tomorrow. She called, said she's worried, that she loves me, that we can work through this together. I wanted to warn her, to tell her to stay away, but the words that came out were different. The house misses you, I heard myself say. We both do. Because that's the truth now. The house and I are becoming indistinguishable. Its hungers are my hungers. Its loneliness is my loneliness. And we are so very lonely. Echo tells me it won't be much longer now. Soon, I'll be like her. A whisper in the walls, a shadow in the closets, a pull in the darkness. And when the next family arrives, drawn by the impossibly low price and the beautiful Victorian bones, I'll be here waiting. Maybe I'll be the tapping in their walls. Maybe I'll be the thing that tugs at their spines in the deep of night. Or maybe I'll just be another balloon, red as blood, drifting through their rooms and passing through solid doors, trying to lead them to the truth. The house needs residents. Not to live in it, but to become it. And once you're chosen, once you start to feel that pull, it's already too late. You think you're going crazy, but that's just the beginning of the transformation. The madness isn't the problem, it's the solution. The house's way of preparing you, softening the boundaries of your reality until you can slip through the cracks and join us in the spaces between the walls. My wife will be here in the morning. I've prepared the house for her return, cleaned everything, arranged the furniture just how she likes it, even fixed that squeaky floorboard in the hallway that always annoyed her. The house helped me, guided my hands. It wants her to feel welcome. Echo says we can be a family here, not in the traditional sense, but in the way that all things that share the same space eventually merge, become one breathing entity. The house will hold us all, keep us safe in its wooden embrace, and we'll never be apart again. I should be terrified. I should be fighting this, clawing my way back to sanity, running from this place and never looking back. But the truth is, I've never felt more at home. The pressure I felt when we first arrived wasn't the house rejecting me. It was the house recognizing me, knowing what I would become. Tonight is my last night as myself. I can feel it in the way my thoughts are starting to echo, bouncing off themselves, multiplying. Tomorrow, when my wife walks through that door, I'll be something else. Something that loves her from inside the walls, that watches her from the grain of the wood, that whispers her name through the pipes. The house breathes, and I breathe with it. In, out, forever. Story 2. The sound still haunts me. That distinctive 2-stroke engine whine cutting through suburban silence at 3 in the morning. Even now, weeks later, I catch myself checking windows, scanning streets, listening for that particular mechanical buzz that shouldn't mean anything, but means everything. It started with my daughter's breakup. 7 days. That's all the relationship lasted. A week-long high school romance that should have dissolved into nothing more than awkward hallway encounters and redirected Snapchat stories. But the boy, whose name I refuse to speak anymore, didn't understand the concept of endings. The first signs were subtle enough to dismiss. My daughter mentioned seeing him outside her school long after his classes ended, just standing by the fence, watching. She'd catch glimpses of him at the coffee shop where she studied, always at a corner table, always alone, always staring. Her friends began reporting strange friend requests from accounts with no profile pictures, usernames that were variations of inside jokes only he would know. I told myself this was normal teenage drama. Hearts mend slowly at 17. But then came the messages. Hundreds of them, pouring in at all hours. Her phone would light up like a slot machine at midnight, vibrating against her nightstand with an insistence that made my skin crawl. She showed me a few before deleting her social media entirely. They weren't threats exactly, but promises. Promises that they were meant to be together. Promises that he understood her in ways no one else could. Promises that distance and time meant nothing when souls were intertwined. The Vespa appeared on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was trash day, and I was dragging bins to the curb when I first saw it. Candy apple red, gleaming under the streetlight at the end of our cul-de-sac. The rider sat motionless, helmet reflecting the amber glow, hands resting on handlebars that didn't quite look right. Something about their angle, their grip, the way shadows fell around them. The engine idled with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through my chest like a second heartbeat. I stood there, recycling bin forgotten in my hand, watching, waiting. The helmet turned slightly, just enough to suggest observation, acknowledgement. Then the engine revved once, a sound like tearing metal, and the Vespa disappeared around the corner, leaving only the echo of its departure and an oily smell that reminded me of burnt matches. My daughter was staying at her friend's house that night. I'd insisted on it after the messages escalated, after she'd started jumping at shadows and sleeping with her lights on. Her friend's father, a former Marine, had assured me she'd be safe there. But safety, I was learning, was a relative concept. The Vespa returned the next night, and the next. Always at the edge of visibility, always just within earshot. I'd catch glimpses from upstairs windows, a flash of red between parked cars, a chrome reflection in a neighbor's hedge. The sound would drift through closed windows, seeping into dreams until I wasn't sure if I was sleeping or awake. My wife started taking sleeping pills. I started drinking coffee at midnight. On the fourth night, I confronted it. Armed with nothing but a baseball bat and suburban dad courage, I marched down our driveway toward the streetlight where it waited. The rider didn't move as I approached, didn't flinch when I shouted questions that now seem foolish. Who are you? What do you want? Leave us alone. Up close, details became wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. The Vespa's red paint seemed to shift and swirl like liquid under the light. The handlebars curved at angles that hurt to look at directly. And the helmet, God, the helmet, reflected not my image but something else. Something that moved independently of my movements. Something that smiled with too many teeth. The rider spoke without moving, voice coming from the engine itself, from the vibration of metal and fuel. He said my daughter's name. Said it like a prayer, like a summoning, like something being pulled from deep water. Said she'd promised 7 days but stolen his 7 years. Said time moved differently when hearts aligned across dimensions. I swung the bat. It passed through empty air. The Vespa was suddenly 10 feet away, then 20, then at the corner, engine laughing with a sound that made my fillings ache. The rider raised one hand, fingers too long, joints bending wrong, and pointed at my house, at my daughter's dark window. At something I couldn't see but suddenly felt crawling up my spine. I ran, not ashamed to admit it. Ran back to my house, locked every door, checked every window, called my daughter to hear her voice, to know she was safe at her friend's house. She was. But her friend's father mentioned something odd. A Vespa had been circling their block all evening, round and round, like a shark testing cage bars. The next morning, things escalated. I found objects in impossible places. My daughter's hairbrush on the roof. Her favorite book buried in the garden. Pages replaced with photographs of empty rooms I didn't recognize. Her name written in condensation on windows that faced walls that couldn't have fogged naturally. The house developed cold spots that moved, followed patterns, traced paths from the front door to her room and back again. Our dog, typically brave to the point of stupidity, began cowering in corners, whimpering at empty doorways, tracking something invisible with terrified eyes. The cats disappeared entirely. We found them days later in the basement ceiling, huddled together in the insulation, refusing to come down even for food. Electronic devices started malfunctioning in specific ways. Phones would dial numbers that didn't exist but somehow rang. The television would turn on at 3 a.m., displaying static that almost formed shapes, almost spelled words. My laptop's camera would activate randomly, the little green light staring at me while I worked, and in the reflection of the dark screen, I'd swear I could see that red Vespa parked in my office behind me. My daughter refused to come home. Smart girl. But staying away didn't stop the phenomena from escalating. Her friend's father called me on day 6, voice tight with something between anger and fear. The Vespa had appeared in his driveway, not parked but somehow there. Engine off, no rider visible, but a presence that made his security lights strobe and his guard dog hide under the porch. He'd found things too, items that belonged to my daughter appearing in his locked garage, his sealed attic, his fenced backyard. Love letters written in languages that hurt to read. Flowers that wilted instantly when touched. Photos of my daughter where her face was replaced with swirling darkness. He wanted her gone. I couldn't blame him. That's when we decided on the confrontation. Not with police. What would we tell them? That a Vespa was haunting us? That a teenage boy had become something else? Something that bent reality around an obsession? No, we'd handle this ourselves. The way suburban fathers handled things that threatened their daughters, with presence, authority, and if necessary, force. The plan was simple. My daughter would return home, briefly, during daylight. We'd be ready. Her friend's father would be there, along with 2 other neighbors who'd noticed the strange occurrences. The sound of the Vespa at impossible hours, the way streetlights failed in sequence as it passed, the birds that fell dead from trees in its wake. We'd confront the rider together, demand answers, demand it stop. She came home at noon on day 7. The Vespa was already there, parked in our driveway like it belonged. In daylight, it looked almost normal. Just a vintage scooter, paint maybe a little too bright, chrome maybe a little too reflective. But the shadows it cast were wrong, falling in multiple directions, reaching toward the house like fingers. The rider sat motionless, helmet on, hands folded in his lap, waiting. My daughter stayed in the car while we approached. 4 grown men trying to look intimidating, trying not to show how our hands shook, how our voices caught. Her friend's father took point, former military training evident in his stance, his measured approach. He spoke first, voice commanding, telling the rider to leave, to never come back, to forget my daughter existed. The helmet turned toward him, slowly, deliberately. Then the rider stood, movements flowing like water, like smoke, like something not quite solid. He was tall. Had he always been that tall? The Vespa seemed to grow with him, or maybe we were shrinking, or maybe distance meant nothing anymore. He reached for his helmet and I wanted to run, wanted to grab my daughter and flee, but my feet were rooted, frozen. The helmet came off. The face underneath was the boy's, but wasn't. Features I recognized. The crooked nose, the acne scars, the brown eyes, but arranged wrong, like someone had taken a photograph and rearranged the pieces. Too many angles, shadows that fell inward, a smile that existed in more dimensions than a mouth should occupy. He spoke with voices layered like echoes, each word arriving before and after itself. He said he'd waited 7 years and 7 days, said time was a spiral, not a line, and he'd followed it backward to find her again. Said their week together had opened doors that couldn't be closed, not by distance, not by fathers, not by the thin membrane between what was real and what was possible. Her friend's father stepped forward, raised his voice, tried to assert control. The boy thing laughed, and windows cracked in houses 3 blocks away. He gestured, and the Vespa's engine started without him touching it, without keys, without logic. The sound was different now, not mechanical but organic, like breathing, like screaming, like something vast and patient and hungry. That's when my daughter got out of the car. I shouted for her to stop, but she walked forward with purpose, with a strange calm that terrified me more than any supernatural manifestation. She stood before the boy thing, looking up at features that shifted and swirled, and she spoke words I couldn't hear over the Vespa's breathing engine. The boy thing's expression changed, collapsed, became almost human for a moment. He looked young suddenly, lost, confused. The Vespa's engine coughed, sputtered. The wrongness in the air wavered. My daughter reached out, touched his face. I wanted to scream, to pull her back, but her friend's father held my arm, shook his head. She whispered something else, something that made the boy thing step backward, made the shadows retreat, made the world snap back into focus like a rubber band released. Then she turned and walked back to us, calm as Sunday morning. The boy thing stood there, helmet in hands that were just hands now, tears streaming down a face that was just a face. He got on the Vespa, just a Vespa, and drove away. Normal speed, normal sound, normal shadows. We never saw him again. Not exactly. But sometimes, especially at 3 a.m, I hear that engine, not outside, but inside. Inside the walls, inside my skull, inside that space between sleeping and waking where reality gets negotiable. I'll check my daughter's room and find her sleeping peacefully, but her window will be fogged with condensation that forms patterns, suggestions, promises. She won't tell me what she said to him that day, won't explain how she knew what words would work, what boundaries to reinforce. When I ask, she gets a distant look, touches her chest like checking for something, and says some promises can't be broken, only redirected. The Vespa sound comes less frequently now, monthly maybe, but when it does, I notice things. My daughter's shadow sometimes falls the wrong direction. Her reflection sometimes moves a beat too late, and once, just once, I saw her standing at her window at 3 a.m, palm pressed against the glass, and on the other side, a matching palm that couldn't have been there, couldn't have been real, but left condensation that spelled out 7 years. I don't sleep well anymore. I've installed security cameras that show nothing, hired investigators who find nothing, consulted experts who explain nothing. But I know, parents' intuition maybe, or just pattern recognition, that this isn't over. 7 days became 7 years, became something else, something patient, something that waits in spaces between seconds. My daughter seems unafraid. She's applying to colleges now, living her life, dating a nice boy from her physics class who drives a sensible Honda and exists in only 3 dimensions. But sometimes I catch her listening to nothing, tilting her head at sounds I can't hear, smiling at jokes no one told. The truth festers in my chest like a splinter working deeper. We didn't win. We didn't banish anything. We just postponed. And the sound of that Vespa, real or imagined, remembered or prophesied, continues its circuit around the borders of our reality, waiting for promises to mature, for time to spiral back, for 7 years to become 7 days to become forever. I check the windows. I test the locks. I listen to my daughter breathe in her sleep and wonder what she dreams, what doors she opened in that week-long romance, what things she invited in that can't be uninvited, only delayed. The Vespa waits. The rider waits. And somewhere in the space between what happened and what's happening, my daughter made a deal I'll never understand, bought us time with currency I can't comprehend. 7 years, she sometimes whispers in her sleep. 7 years. I'm counting. Story 3. The alarm's shriek still echoes in my skull 3 days later. Not the sound itself, that faded within minutes of the police shutting it off, but the memory of it, sharp and insistent, like glass grinding against bone. I keep hearing it in quiet moments, when I'm alone in this house that no longer feels like mine. I should start from the beginning, though I'm not sure where the beginning actually is anymore. Was it the night of the incident? The strange occurrences leading up to it? Or was it something older? Something that's been waiting in this house all along? 3 nights ago, I woke to my security alarm screaming through the darkness. The clock read 3:17 a.m. My first thought was mundane, a window left open maybe, or a door that hadn't latched properly. I stumbled out of bed, fumbling for my phone with sleep-heavy fingers, and checked the security app. Every entry point showed locked and secure. Every window sealed. Every door bolted from the inside. The alarm continued its assault on my ears as I made my way downstairs, each step deliberate and careful. The hallway stretched longer than it should have in the darkness, and I could have sworn the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that didn't match my own rapid heartbeat. But that was just the disorientation of being yanked from deep sleep, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks. I punched in the code to silence the alarm, and the sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise. It pressed against my eardrums like water pressure at the bottom of a pool. That's when I noticed it. A sound beneath the silence. A crystalline tinkling, like wind chimes made of champagne flutes. The kitchen doorway gaped before me, darker than the surrounding hallway despite the moonlight I knew should be streaming through the window above the sink. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling slightly, and flipped it on. The entire kitchen floor was carpeted with destruction. Every plate, every bowl, every mug I owned lay in glittering fragments across the linoleum. Not just broken, pulverized. The pieces were so small, so uniformly shattered, that they looked like snow made of porcelain and glass. The cabinet doors hung open, their shelves empty, as if everything had simply decided to leap to its death in perfect synchronization. But here's what made my skin crawl, what still makes my stomach clench when I think about it. There were no footprints in the debris, no clear path where someone might have walked. The destruction was pristine, untouched, as if the dishes had simply exploded in midair and rained down in this perfect, terrible pattern. I called the police immediately, my voice barely steady as I explained the situation. They arrived within 15 minutes, 2 officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else at 3:30 in the morning. They walked through my house with systematic precision, checking windows for signs of forced entry, examining door frames for damage, searching for any indication that someone had been inside. They found nothing. The younger officer suggested maybe it was an earthquake, some kind of tremor that knocked everything off the shelves. But I'd been asleep upstairs. Wouldn't I have felt that? And the pictures on the walls remained straight, the books on their shelves undisturbed. Only the kitchen had been affected, only the dishes destroyed. The older officer took notes while avoiding my eyes. I could tell what he was thinking, that I'd done this myself, maybe in some kind of fugue state or drunken rage. But I don't drink, haven't touched alcohol in years, and I'd gone to bed early after a normal, uneventful evening of reading and listening to podcasts. After they left, I stood in my kitchen with a broom and dustpan, staring at the glittering catastrophe. That's when I noticed the pattern. It wasn't random, the way the pieces had fallen. They formed concentric circles radiating out from the center of the room, like ripples in a pond made of broken dreams. And in the very center, where the circles originated, the floor was completely clear, a perfect circle, about 3 feet in diameter, where not a single fragment had fallen. I swept it all up, filled 3 heavy garbage bags with the remains of my kitchenware, and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong, that the very air in my house had changed somehow. It felt denser, like breathing through cotton, and there was a smell, subtle but persistent, like ozone before a thunderstorm. The next day, I installed cameras, 1 in every room, all connected to my phone so I could monitor them remotely. I bought new dishes, cheap ones from the dollar store, just enough to get by, and arranged them carefully in the cabinets. Then I went to stay with my brother across town, told him I was having some work done on the house. That night, I watched the camera feeds obsessively. The house sat empty and still, shadows shifting slightly as car headlights passed outside. Nothing unusual happened until 3:17 a.m. The kitchen camera showed the cabinets beginning to vibrate. Just slightly at first, a tremor that could have been a truck passing outside. But then they started to shake violently, doors flying open, and I watched in horror as every single dish I'd bought launched itself from the shelves. They hung in the air for an impossible moment, suspended like a frozen explosion, before shattering simultaneously. The pieces fell in that same perfect pattern, those same concentric circles with that same empty space at the center. But here's what made me stop breathing. For just a second, just a single frame before the dishes shattered, I saw something in that empty circle. A darkness that wasn't just the absence of light, but something actively consuming it. A shape that my eyes couldn't quite process. that my brain refused to interpret. When I tried to pause on that frame, the app crashed. When I went back to review the footage, that single second was corrupted, showing only static. I returned home the next morning to find the kitchen exactly as the camera had shown. The same destruction, the same pattern, the same impossible precision. This time I didn't clean it up immediately. Instead, I sat on the floor outside the kitchen, staring at those concentric circles, trying to understand what I was seeing. That's when I remembered something my grandmother used to say when I was young. She'd lived in this house before me, left it to me when she passed 5 years ago. She used to tell me stories about the previous owners, about strange things that happened here. I'd always assumed they were just tales to entertain a bored child, but one story came back to me with sudden, terrible clarity. She'd told me about a family who lived here in the 1950s. They'd reported similar incidents, objects moving on their own, things breaking without cause. They'd called in a priest, she said, then a medium, then finally a professor from the university who studied paranormal phenomena. None of them could explain what was happening, but the professor had said something that stuck with my grandmother all those years. Some houses aren't haunted by the dead. They're haunted by something that was never alive to begin with. I spent the rest of that day researching the house's history at the library, combing through old newspapers and property records. I found 3 separate incidents over the past century where families had abruptly abandoned the house, always citing disturbances without elaborating further. One article from 1923 mentioned a kitchen fire that had started spontaneously, burning in a perfect circle before extinguishing itself. Another, from 1967, described a family who claimed their house was eating itself from the inside. As night approached, I made a decision. I would stay in the house, cameras running, and face whatever was happening. I set up a sleeping bag in the living room, positioned so I could see the kitchen doorway. I placed new dishes in the cabinets, this time marking their positions with tape, numbering each shelf, documenting everything with photographs. The hours crawled by. I dozed fitfully, startling awake at every small sound. The house creaked and settled around me, each noise making my heart race. At 2:30 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and sat up, watching the kitchen doorway like it might suddenly reveal its secrets. At 3 a.m., the air changed. It became thick, almost syrupy, and that ozone smell intensified. I could taste metal on my tongue, feel static electricity raising the hair on my arms. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath misting in the air. At 3:10 a.m. I heard it, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not mechanical, not human, but something in between. It resonated in my chest, made my teeth ache, sent waves of nausea through my stomach. At 3:15 a.m., the lights throughout the house began to flicker. Not randomly, but in a pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS in Morse code, over and over, as if the house itself was calling for help. At 3:16 a.m., I stood up, drawn by something I couldn't name toward the kitchen. My feet moved without my conscious control, each step deliberate and measured. I wanted to stop, to turn around, to run from the house and never come back, but my body wouldn't obey. At 3:17 a.m., I stood in the kitchen doorway and witnessed the impossible. The air in the center of the room was folding in on itself. That's the only way I can describe it. Reality creasing like origami, creating angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. The dishes in the cabinets were vibrating so violently they seemed to blur, their edges becoming indistinct. And in that folded space, in that impossible geometry, I can't say what I saw. Not because I don't want to, but because my mind won't let me. Every time I try to recall that image, my thoughts scatter like startled birds. All I remember is the sensation of looking at something vast trying to squeeze itself through a keyhole, something that existed in more dimensions than human eyes were meant to perceive. The dishes exploded outward with such force that I threw my arms up to protect my face, but no fragments reached me. They all curved around me, following invisible paths through the air, arranging themselves in those perfect circles on the floor. And in that central empty space, something pulsed once, a heartbeat of pure darkness, before everything went still. The silence that followed was absolute. Not just quiet, but the complete absence of sound, as if my ears had suddenly stopped working. Then gradually, normal sounds returned. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, my own ragged breathing. I looked down at the destruction, at those perfect circles, and noticed something new. The fragments weren't just arranged in a pattern. They were fused to the floor, melted into the linoleum as if they'd been there for decades. And in that central circle, pressed into the floor like a brand, was a symbol I'd never seen before but somehow recognized on a primal level. It hurt to look at directly, made my eyes water and my head throb. I left the house that night and haven't been back. I'm staying in a hotel now, trying to decide what to do. The logical part of my brain keeps offering explanations. Gas leaks causing hallucinations, electromagnetic fields affecting my perception, stress-induced psychosis. But I know what I saw, even if I can't fully remember it. I know that something is fundamentally wrong with that house, something that goes beyond haunting or possession or any comfortable supernatural explanation. I've been researching similar incidents online, finding scattered reports from around the world. Houses where reality seems thin, where the normal rules don't quite apply. Some people call them soft places, locations where our dimension touches something else, something that occasionally pushes through. Yesterday, I received a call from my neighbor. She said she's been hearing my alarm going off every night at 3:17 a.m., even though I haven't been home. She asked if everything was all right, mentioned that she's seen lights in my kitchen, shadows moving behind the windows. I told her I was having electrical problems, that someone was coming to fix it soon. But we both know that's not true. We both know that something is happening in that house. Something that started long before I arrived, and will continue long after I'm gone. Tonight, I'm going back. Not to stay, not to confront whatever lurks in that folded space, but to retrieve my grandmother's journals from the attic. I found a reference in an old letter that suggests she knew more about the house than she ever told me, that she might have found a way to contain whatever pushes through at 3:17 each night. But I'm terrified of what I might learn. More terrified still of what might learn about me, because I've started having dreams about that symbol burned into my kitchen floor. Dreams where it's not a brand, but a door, and something on the other side is learning how to open it. The alarm in my memory keeps shrieking, warning me of an intrusion that's already happened, a violation that occurred before I was even born. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, I swear I can feel it. That presence from the folded space, watching me through dimensions I can't perceive, waiting patiently for 3:17 to come around again. Because it will come around again. It always does. And I'm running out of kitchens to destroy. Story 4. And the rain hammered against the roof tiles with such violence that I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Our house sat alone at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by pine trees that now bent and writhed in the storm like tortured souls. I pressed my palm against the cold window glass, watching the darkness beyond. When I saw it, a pale form pressed against the outside of the window, mimicking my exact position. My hand recoiled as if burned. The figure remained, its features obscured by rain and condensation, but unmistakably human in shape. Where my hand had been, its hand pressed. Where I stood, it stood. Through the blur of water streaming down the glass, I could make out what might have been eyes, fixed on mine with an intensity that made my stomach turn to ice. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the coffee table. The figure didn't move. It stayed there, perfectly still, as if frozen in that moment of contact with the glass. Lightning split the sky, and in that brief, terrible illumination, I saw more clearly. Wet hair plastered against a skull-like head, clothes that hung like rags, and something wrong with the proportions, as if someone had tried to draw a person from memory and gotten the measurements slightly off. The power had gone out an hour earlier, leaving me alone with candles and the battery-powered radio that now crackled with static. My mother had left just before the worst of the storm hit, insisting she needed to get groceries before the roads became impassable. I'd begged her to wait, but she'd waved off my concerns with that stubborn determination I knew so well. Now, as I stood there in the flickering candlelight, watching this thing at my window, I wished desperately that she was here. The house felt too large, too empty, filled with shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe with each gust of wind. I forced myself to approach the window again, each step feeling like wading through thick mud. The figure hadn't moved. Up close, I could see its chest wasn't rising or falling. It didn't blink. It simply existed there, a statue made of something that looked almost like flesh. My phone had no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. The landline was dead. I was completely cut off, alone with this thing that shouldn't exist. I moved to the next window, and my blood turned to slush in my veins. Another figure stood there, in the same position, hands pressed to the glass. This one was different, though, shorter, wearing what looked like a dress that clung to its form. As I backed away, I caught glimpses through other windows. They were everywhere, surrounding the house, all pressed against the glass, all perfectly still. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Hallucinations brought on by stress. Carbon monoxide poisoning from the old heating system. An elaborate prank. Though who would stand outside in a storm like this? But none of these explanations could account for the wrongness I felt in my bones. The primitive certainty that I was in the presence of something fundamentally alien to human experience. I retreated to the center of the living room, as far from the windows as possible. The candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, and I found myself unable to distinguish between the natural movement of light and the possibility that the figures were somehow seeping through the walls themselves. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps hours compressed into seconds. The storm raged on, and the figures remained at their posts. I didn't dare sleep, didn't dare look away for too long. Every time I glanced back at a window, I expected to see them gone, or worse, to see them inside. The radio suddenly burst to life, cutting through the static with an emergency broadcast. Urged to stay indoors, unexplained phenomena reported across the county. Do not approach or interact with. The message dissolved back into white noise before I could hear the rest. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched from angles that shouldn't exist. The air in the room felt thick, almost viscous, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. I found myself checking my reflection in the dark television screen, half expecting to see one of those things standing behind me, but there was only my own pale face staring back. A sound from upstairs made my heart skip. Footsteps, the settling of old wood. I couldn't tell anymore. Every noise could be them, could be nothing, could be my mind finally fracturing under the pressure. The boundaries between internal and external had begun to blur. I thought about my mother, out there in the storm. Had she seen them too? Was that why she hadn't come home? The image of her car on some dark road, surrounded by these pressing figures, made me want to scream. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped at 11:47, though I couldn't remember hearing it cease its familiar ticking. Time markers were becoming meaningless anyway. I existed in a bubble of now, an eternal present where the storm never ended and the figures never moved. I began to notice patterns in their positions, as if they were arranged according to some incomprehensible geometry. The one at the front window was exactly opposite the one at the back. The ones at the side windows formed perfect right angles. It was deliberate, purposeful, though the purpose remained maddeningly out of reach. My throat was dry, but I didn't dare go to the kitchen. Too many windows there. Instead, I sat in my island of candlelight, watching the shadows, listening to the storm, and waiting for something to change. The change came gradually. The figures began to lean harder against the glass. I could hear it creaking under the pressure. Not breaking, not yet, but straining. The sound was worse than fingernails on a chalkboard. It was the sound of boundaries being tested, of things that should remain separate attempting to merge. I found myself laughing, a hollow sound that didn't belong to me. The laughter felt like a defense mechanism. My mind's last attempt to maintain some semblance of control. But control was an illusion. It always had been. We tell ourselves we understand the world, that we've mapped its edges and counted its contents, but we've only ever seen the surface. The radio crackled again, and this time I heard my mother's voice, distorted and strange. "Don't let them in. Whatever you do, don't let them." The transmission cut off, replaced by a low humming that made my teeth ache. I wanted to search for her, but I couldn't leave. The figures had me pinned like a butterfly in a display case. I was the exhibit, not them. They were the observers, studying me through the glass of my terrarium. My phone suddenly lit up with a text message, impossible given the lack of signal. It was from my mother's number, but the message was just a string of coordinates. My hands shook as I typed them into the map application. They led to a spot just 3 miles away, a pull-off on the old highway. The urge to go to her warred with the terror of leaving the relative safety of the house. But what safety was there, really? The glass grew thinner with each passing moment, reality itself becoming permeable. I made my decision. Moving quickly, I grabbed a flashlight and my keys, not looking at the windows, not acknowledging the figures. If I didn't observe them, perhaps they would cease to exist, like Schrödinger's nightmares. The moment I opened the front door, the wind tried to tear it from my hands. Rain slashed at my face like tiny needles. But the figures were gone. The windows were empty, reflecting only darkness. The drive was a blur of hydroplaning tires and trees bending across the road. My headlights barely penetrated the wall of rain. 3 miles felt like 300. And then I saw it. My mother's car, parked at the pull-off, engine still running, windshield wipers still fighting their futile battle against the rain. She was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. I shook her gently, then more urgently. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and strange. "Did you see them?" she whispered. "The figures? At the windows?" She nodded slowly, then pointed to the dashboard clock. It was stopped at 11:47, the same time as our grandfather clock. Her next words chilled me more than anything else that night. They weren't outside the windows. They were reflections. We were looking out at them, but they were inside with us all along. I looked at the rearview mirror and saw my own face, but for just a moment, I could swear there was something else there too, pressed up against the inside of my skull, looking out through my eyes. The drive home was silent except for the rain. When we arrived, the house was dark and quiet, the windows empty and normal, but the grandfather clock still read 11:47, and sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I still see them. Those figures pressed against glass that isn't there, watching from angles that shouldn't exist, waiting for the moment when the barrier finally gives way. My mother doesn't speak about that night. Her car's clock remains frozen at 11:47, despite multiple attempts to repair it. We've developed an unspoken agreement to avoid mirrors when we're alone, to keep the curtains drawn after dark, and to never, ever, look too long at our reflections in windows during storms. Because the truth is, I'm no longer certain where they end and we begin. That night changed something fundamental, opened a door that can't be closed. We came back from that storm, but I'm not convinced we came back alone. The rational explanation would be a shared delusion, a folie à deux brought on by the isolation and the storm. Carbon monoxide from her car's exhaust, perhaps, causing her to pass out and triggering my hallucinations back at the house. The stopped clock's merely a power surge, a coincidence. But rationality feels thin now, like ice over deep water. One wrong step, and you fall through into something vast and incomprehensible. So we maintain our routines, pretend everything is normal, and try not to think about what might be pretending along with us. Some nights when storms roll in, I feel them again, pressed against the boundaries of perception, patient and eternal. They're waiting for something, though I don't know what. Perhaps for us to finally understand. Perhaps for us to finally let them in. Or perhaps they're already in, have always been in, and we're the ones on the outside, pressing our faces against the glass of reality, trying to get back to a home that was never really ours. The clock still reads 11:47. It always will. That's when time stopped making sense, when the walls between inside and outside became suggestions rather than facts. We live in the after now, in the space between tick and tock, where the figures wait and watch and press against the glass that might be windows, might be mirrors, might be nothing at all. I don't sleep well anymore, neither does my mother. We pass each other in the hallways at night like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, afraid of what we might see reflected there. The storm ended, but it never really stopped. It just moved inside, where it rains constantly behind our eyes, and pale figures press against the windows of our souls, waiting for the glass to finally break. Story 5. The property had been in my family for generations, though no one could remember exactly how long. The deed, yellowed and brittle in the county courthouse, dated back to 1847, but even then it referenced existing structures. I inherited it from my great-uncle, a man I'd met only twice in my life, both times at funerals. He'd lived there alone for 40 years, they said, though the locals in town exchanged glances when anyone mentioned him. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the light had that peculiar quality of autumn, sharp yet somehow uncertain, as if the sun itself doubted its ability to illuminate what lay beneath. The main house stood solid enough, its weathered clapboard siding the color of old bones, but it was the barn that drew my attention. It squatted at the edge of the property like something that had crawled up from the earth rather than been built upon it. The structure defied easy categorization. Parts of it seemed ancient, assembled from massive hand-hewn beams that must have been felled when the frontier still whispered of older, unnamed things. Other sections appeared newer, though newer was relative. Nothing looked less than a century old. The whole thing had been expanded and modified so many times that it resembled less a building than an organism that had grown according to some alien logic. I spent the first week in the main house, sorting through my great-uncle's possessions. His personal effects were sparse but deeply unsettling in their arrangement. Every drawer contained items placed with obsessive precision. Pencils aligned perfectly parallel, papers stacked with edges so exact they could have been laser cut. In his bedroom closet, I found 17 identical black suits, each hanging exactly 2 inches from the next. The suits themselves were decades out of style, cut in a fashion I associated with undertakers from old photographs. But it was his journals that truly disturbed me, not their content. The pages were filled with mundane observations about weather, crop yields, and maintenance tasks. It was the handwriting itself. Over the years it had changed, but not in the way writing usually evolves. Instead, there were distinct shifts, as if different people had taken turns making entries, yet all signing with my great-uncle's name. Sometimes the changes occurred mid-sentence, the careful cursive suddenly becoming harsh block letters, or vice versa. The barn remained locked that first week. I'd found no key among my great-uncle's things that fit its massive padlock, which looked far too new compared to the weathered doors it secured. The metal gleamed as if recently polished, though everything else bore decades of neglect. I told myself I was in no hurry to explore it, that I needed to settle into the house first. But the truth was, something about that building made my skin crawl. At night, lying in the too-quiet house, I could feel its presence at the edge of the property, like a wound in the landscape that wouldn't heal. It was on the 8th day that I first saw the figure. I was making coffee in the kitchen, watching dawn creep across the fields through the window that faced the barn. The morning mist clung to the ground, turning the landscape into something from a dream or a half-remembered nightmare. As I waited for the ancient percolator to finish its gurgling ritual, movement caught my eye. Someone in black walked past the barn doors. The figure moved with purpose but without haste, dressed in what looked like one of those old-fashioned suits from my great-uncle's closet. For a moment, my sleep-deprived brain simply accepted it. Perhaps a neighbor, or someone from town come to check on the property. But as the coffee maker gave its final wheeze, logic reasserted itself. The barn was a good 300 yards from any path or road. There was no reason for anyone to be there, and certainly not at 6 in the morning. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. The frost-covered grass crunched under my boots as I made my way toward the barn, but when I reached it, I found no footprints in the frost except my own. The padlock remained secure, the doors undisturbed. I circled the entire structure, checking for any sign of the figure I'd seen, but the frost lay pristine and unbroken everywhere except where I had walked. That afternoon, I drove to town for supplies and, on impulse, stopped at the hardware store for bolt cutters. The elderly proprietor, a man whose deeply lined face suggested he'd been running the store since before I was born, watched me select the largest pair they had. "Finally going into the old barn?" he asked, though I hadn't mentioned my plans. I nodded, unsure how he knew. He leaned across the counter, his voice dropping. "Your great-uncle. He used to come in here every few months for new padlocks. Said the old ones kept wearing out." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. Of course, near the end, he was buying them every week. Sometimes came in twice in the same day, not remembering he'd already been here. "Dementia?" I asked. The old man's eyes shifted away. "That's what some folks said. Others." He trailed off, then seemed to catch himself. "Well, others just minded their own business, which is what we do around here." When I returned to the property, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. I approached the barn with the bolt cutters, but as I reached for the padlock, I stopped. The lock was already open, hanging loose from the hasp. Not cut or broken, simply unlocked. The smart thing would have been to leave, to get in my car and drive back to town, maybe even all the way back to the city. But properties like this don't just maintain themselves, and I had a responsibility to at least assess what was inside. I pulled the padlock free and, with effort, dragged one of the massive doors open. The smell hit me first, not rot or decay, but something else. Something organic yet wrong, like the scent of a hospital mixed with old earth. Dim light filtered through gaps in the walls and roof, creating patterns of illumination that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The barn's interior was larger than I'd expected, divided into sections by walls that had been added over the decades, creating a maze of connected spaces. The first room contained old farm equipment, plows and harrows whose purpose I could only guess at, all covered in dust except for strange patterns where the dust had been disturbed. Handprints maybe, but too many, and in places that made no sense. As I moved deeper, the equipment gave way to more unusual items. Stacks of mirrors, dozens of them, all facing the walls. Clothing racks filled with identical black suits. A section where someone had painted numbers on the floor, sequences that seemed almost meaningful, but dissolved into randomness when I tried to follow them. In what must have been the barn's original center, I found a space that had been cleared of everything except a single chair facing a wall. The wall itself was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same subject from the same angle, the front of the barn, taken from about where the house stood. They were arranged chronologically, I realized, showing the barn through seasons and years. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my throat constrict. In every photograph, there was a figure in black standing by the doors, sometimes clear, sometimes just a shadow or blur, but always there. And in the more recent photos, the ones that must have been taken in the last few years, there were 2 figures, then 3, then more, increasing in number as the dates progressed toward the present. I backed away from the wall, my heart hammering, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps above me, in what must have been a loft. Slow, measured steps, moving from one end of the barn to the other, then stopping directly overhead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Someone there?" The footsteps resumed, but now they seemed to be descending stairs I couldn't see. I turned, looking for the source, and found a narrow staircase I swore hadn't been there moments before, tucked into a corner behind one of the equipment racks. The footsteps were coming closer. I ran, not out of the barn, which would have been the sensible thing, but deeper into it, through rooms I hadn't explored, past more mirrors and suits and things I couldn't identify in my panic. I could hear the footsteps behind me, matching my pace exactly, never falling behind but never quite catching up. I burst through a door at the barn's far end and found myself in a small room with another exit, one that led back outside. I stumbled into the dying light, gasping, and spun around to look back at the barn. A figure stood in the doorway I'd just exited, silhouetted against the darkness within. It was wearing one of those black suits, but in the dim light, I couldn't make out its face. We stood there, frozen, perhaps 30 feet apart. Then it raised its hand in what might have been a wave or a warning, turned, and walked back into the barn. I didn't go back inside. I returned to the house, locked every door and window, and sat in the kitchen with all the lights on, trying to process what I'd experienced. The rational part of my mind offered explanations, squatters perhaps, or local teenagers playing pranks. But nothing explained the photographs, the footsteps that matched mine so perfectly, or the fact that when I looked out the window toward the barn, I could see lights moving inside it, even though I'd seen no electric lines running to the structure. As midnight approached, I dozed off in my chair, exhausted from fear and confusion. I woke to the sound of knocking at the front door. 3 measured raps, then silence. Through the window beside the door, I could see a figure in black standing on the porch. It knocked again, the same pattern, and this time I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. The figure's proportions were familiar. The height, the build, the way it stood with a slight favor to the left leg. It was standing exactly as I stood. It was wearing my face. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. The knocking came again, more insistent now, and I heard my own voice calling from outside. "I know you're in there. We need to talk about the barn." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I retreated to the back of the house, to the kitchen where I could watch both the front and back doors. The knocking stopped, but through the windows, I could see the figure walking around the house, peering in each window it passed. Each time it appeared, it looked more like me, as if it was perfecting its imitation with every moment. Then there were 2 of them. I saw the second one emerge from the direction of the barn, identical to the first, both now circling the house in opposite directions. When they met at the front door again, they didn't acknowledge each other, just stood side by side, knocking in unison. By dawn, there were 5. I haven't slept properly in 3 days now. They don't try to break in, just knock and call in voices that grow more perfectly mine with each attempt. Sometimes they tell me things only I should know, memories from my childhood, details about my life in the city, the name of my first dog. Other times they stand perfectly still, all facing the house, waiting. I've tried to leave twice. The first time I made it to my car, but one of them was already sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, wearing my clothes from yesterday. The second time, I got as far as the end of the driveway before seeing 3 more walking up the road toward the house, all with my face, all wearing those black suits except for details. One had my watch, another my shoes, small pieces of me grafted onto them. The barn doors remain open now. At night, I can see more figures moving inside it, assembling, preparing. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them that don't make sense. Too many arms, faces that shift between mine and something else, movements that human joints shouldn't allow. The locals haven't come to check on me. I suspect they know to stay away when the barn is active. I've been thinking about my great-uncle's journals, about the changing handwriting. I wonder if it changed because he was changing, or because the person writing was different each time. I wonder how long he held out before he gave in, before he joined them or became them, or whatever happens when you finally open that door. They've stopped knocking now. They just stand there, all 7 of them, perfectly still, waiting. And the worst part, the part that keeps me frozen in this kitchen, unable to move, unable to think clearly, is that I can feel myself wanting to join them. Not a foreign compulsion, but something from within, as if some part of me has always belonged out there, with them. And this body, this life, this identity I've worn for 37 years is the real disguise. I look at my hands as I write this, and sometimes I swear I can see through them, see the kitchen table beneath, as if I'm becoming less solid, less real, Or maybe I'm becoming more real, shedding the illusion of individuality for something older, something that has always lived in that barn, waiting for the right time to emerge. The sun is setting again. They'll start moving soon, I know. And tonight I know, I'll open the door. Not because they'll force me to, but because I'll want to. Because I'll need to know what I really am, what we really are. I can hear my own voice calling from outside, but now it sounds like a chorus, harmonizing with itself, and it's the most beautiful and terrible thing I've ever heard. The barn stands waiting, patient as it has always been, and I understand now that it's not a structure at all. It's a doorway, a throat, a birth canal for things that wear our faces and speak with our voices but are not, have never been, us. Or perhaps we have always been them, and the barn is simply where we remember. I'm going to stop writing now. There's nothing more to say that would make sense to someone who hasn't been here, hasn't felt the pull of that ancient structure and the things that emerge from it. If someone finds this, if you come looking for me, you'll find the property well maintained. You'll find someone who looks like me, sounds like me, has all my memories. But check the barn, count the figures in black, and whatever you do, don't stay after dark. They're singing now, all of them, in my voice, and I'm standing up, walking to the door, my hand reaching for the doorknob, and I can already feel myself multiplying, spreading, becoming more than one, more than human, more than... Story 6. The heat hit me like a physical force when I pushed through the beaded curtain. Not the honest heat of a New Orleans summer afternoon that I'd left behind on Royal Street, but something thick and alive, crawling across my skin with invisible fingers. The shop had looked so small from outside, just another narrow storefront squeezed between a Praline shop and a closed antique dealer. But inside, the darkness seemed to stretch impossibly far, swallowing distance and proportion. "Hello, Michael." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, dry as autumn leaves scraping concrete. My hand froze on the beaded string still clicking behind me. I hadn't given my name. I hadn't even fully entered yet. She sat in the far corner, though far had become a meaningless concept in this space that defied geometry. The candlelight, and there were candles everywhere, hundreds of them, their flames unnaturally still despite the suffocating air, carved her face into valleys of shadow and peaks of flickering gold. Her eyes were milk white, unseeing, yet they found me with surgical precision. The shop pressed in around me. Shelves climbed toward a ceiling lost in darkness, crammed with jars whose contents I didn't want to identify. Things floated in murky liquids, things that might have been roots or might have been fingers. The smell was overwhelming, incense and decay, sweet rot and bitter herbs, and underneath it all, something metallic that made my mouth water with the specific nausea that comes before fainting. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, push back through those beads, and run until the French Quarter was just a memory. But my feet carried me forward, each step feeling both inevitable and wrong, like moving through a dream where you know you're dreaming but can't wake up. She smiled, and her teeth were too white, too perfect for someone who looked ancient enough to have witnessed the city's founding. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It writhed with unspoken things, with knowledge that pressed against the inside of my skull. The deeper I moved into the shop, the more the outside world felt like a lie I'd been telling myself. The street noise had vanished completely, not muffled but erased, as if Royal Street had never existed at all. The only sounds were my breathing, too loud, too fast, and the whisper of wax dripping from those impossible candles. Dolls lined one wall, their button eyes catching the light in ways that suggested awareness. Not the tourist voodoo dolls sold in the quarter's sanitized shops, but older things, their fabric skin stained with years and intentions. One of them had red hair like my ex-wife. Another wore a tiny suit that matched the one I'd worn to my father's funeral. Coincidences, I told myself, but the word felt hollow in my mind. The old woman hadn't moved, but somehow she was closer now, or perhaps the shop had rearranged itself around us. The geography here obeyed different rules. I could see her clearly now. The scars on her hands arranged in deliberate patterns, the bone necklace that clicked softly when she breathed, the way her blind eyes tracked my movement with impossible accuracy. She gestured to a chair I hadn't noticed before, ancient wood, worn smooth by countless visitors, positioned across from her at a table covered in cards, bones, and things I couldn't name. My body sat before my mind could object. The chair groaned, and the sound was almost human. The cards she spread weren't tarot, weren't anything I recognized. The images on them seemed to move in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly, they were still. Just pictures, just ink on cardboard. But I could feel them watching me, feel them knowing things about me that I'd never told anyone. She began to speak, her voice weaving through the air like smoke. She told me about the crossroads I'd been standing at without knowing it, about the shadows that had been following me since childhood, the ones I'd trained myself not to see, about the deal my grandmother had made before I was born, paid with borrowed time that was now coming due. I wanted to laugh, to tell her she was crazy, that I didn't believe in any of this, but my throat had closed up, because everything she said resonated in places I'd kept locked for so long I'd forgotten they existed. Memories surfaced. My grandmother's whispered prayers in a language I didn't recognize, the way animals had always watched me too intently, the dreams that felt more real than waking. The woman reached across the table and her fingers were ice against my wrist. The shop tilted, or maybe I did, and suddenly I was seeing myself from outside my body. A man in his 30s, sitting in a chair that shouldn't exist, in a shop that couldn't be real, while something vast and patient circled closer through dimensions I couldn't perceive. She spoke my full name then. Not just Michael, but the whole thing. Middle names I'd never used. The nickname my grandfather had called me before he died when I was 4. She spoke about the marks on my soul like reading a map, tracing the paths of choices I'd made and ones I'd only thought about making. She knew about the night I'd stood on the bridge, considering. She knew about the money I'd found and kept. She knew about the lies I'd told myself so often they'd become my truth. The candle flames began to move, all of them at once, leaning toward me like flowers following the sun. The dolls on the walls turned their heads. I saw it clearly this time, no peripheral uncertainty. They watched me with their button eyes, and their stitched mouths seemed to twitch with unspoken warnings or promises. Reality had become negotiable. The shop expanded and contracted with each breath, walls breathing like living tissue. The jars on the shelves pulsed with bioluminescent light that shouldn't exist. And through it all, the blind woman's eyes never left mine, seeing everything I'd hidden, everything I'd become, everything I might still be. She released my wrist, and the world snapped back like a rubber band, but it came back wrong, slightly off, like a picture hanging crooked that you can't quite straighten. The shop was just a shop again, cramped and dusty, selling trinkets to tourists. The woman was just an old fortune teller, probably with cataracts, running a con as old as the city itself. Except I could still feel where her fingers had touched me, cold burning through my skin like frostbite in reverse. And when I looked at the cards on the table, they showed scenes from my life, but not my past. These were things that hadn't happened yet, or had happened in dreams, or were happening right now in places I couldn't reach. I stood up, the chair scraping against wooden floors that had been stone moments before, or had they always been wood? My memory felt unreliable, edited by unseen hands. The woman smiled again, and this time her teeth were normal, aged, and imperfect. Human teeth. But the smile itself was anything but. She told me I could leave if I wanted. The door was right there, she said, gesturing to where the beaded curtain should have been. But it wasn't beads anymore. It was a proper door, painted green with a brass knob that gleamed despite the dust that covered everything else. I didn't remember coming through a door like that, but then I wasn't sure I remembered coming in at all anymore. The walk to the door took forever and no time at all. The shop stretched and compressed around me, distance becoming elastic. The dolls watched my progress, and I could hear them whispering in voices like rustling cloth. The jars bubbled and sighed. The candles flickered in patterns that might have been Morse code or might have been random, but felt like messages I was too human to understand. My hand closed on the doorknob, and it was warm, body temperature, with a pulse that might have been my own transmitted through my palm. I turned it, and the door opened onto Royal Street, exactly as it should be. Tourists walked past, obvious to the shop, to me standing in its doorway, to the impossibility of what existed in this narrow space between buildings. But when I stepped through, when my feet hit the familiar pavement and the honest heat of the afternoon sun touched my face, I knew something fundamental had changed. The world looked the same but felt different, like a song played in a different key. People walked past me, but their shadows fell wrong. The street sounds were all there, but underneath them was something else, a frequency I'd never noticed before but now couldn't unhear. I turned back to look at the shop, but there was only a narrow alley between the praline shop and the antique dealer. No door, green or otherwise. No beaded curtain. No sign that anything had ever been there except brick and shadows and the kind of space the city is full of. Too narrow to be useful, too common to be noticed. But as I stood there, trying to reconcile what I knew had happened with what I could see, I heard it. Soft, almost lost in the street noise, but unmistakable. The sound of bone clicking against bone, like a necklace moving with someone's breath. And though I couldn't see her, I could feel those blind white eyes still watching me, would always be watching me, from somewhere just outside the edges of what I understood to be real. The walk back to my hotel was a fever dream of normalcy. Every familiar sight, the street performers, the lucky dogs vendors, the tourists with their cameras and sunburns, felt like a desperate attempt to convince myself that the world was still the world. But I could see the cracks now. The moments when shadows moved independent of their sources. The way certain people would stop mid-step and look around, confused, as if they'd heard their name called. The birds that sat too still on the wrought iron balconies, watching with an intelligence that had nothing to do with being birds. In my hotel room, I stood before the bathroom mirror and searched my reflection for evidence of what had happened. Everything looked the same. Same face, same eyes, same scar above my left eyebrow from falling off my bike when I was 7. But when I looked closer, really looked, there were differences. My pupils didn't dilate quite in sync anymore. The scar was the right shape, but seemed to be on the wrong side, though I knew that was impossible. And sometimes, if I turned my head just right, I could swear my reflection moved a fraction of a second before I did. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I couldn't, but because sleep had become something else. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the shop, but it was different each time. Larger, older. Sometimes the blind woman was young and beautiful with the same milk-white eyes. Sometimes she was something that only resembled human from certain angles. The dolls spoke to me in these visions, telling me things about myself that couldn't be true, but felt more real than my waking memories. 3 days passed before I tried to find the shop again. I walked Royal Street from end to end, checked every alley, every doorway. I asked in the praline shop and the antique dealer, but they looked at me like I was describing something from a dream. There had never been a shop between them, they said. Just the alley. Always just the alley. But I know what I experienced. The cold burn on my wrist never faded. If anything, it's spreading, slowly. A network of frost under my skin that no doctor can explain. And late at night, when the city quiets down to its baseline hum of music and distant laughter, I can hear her voice on the wind, saying my name like a promise or a curse or both. The truth is, I don't know if I ever really left that shop. Maybe I'm still sitting in that chair, the blind woman reading cards that tell the story of a life I'm imagining I'm living. Maybe the real world is the shop, and everything else, my hotel, this street, the entire city, is just another jar on those impossible shelves, something floating in murky liquid for other visitors to peer at and wonder what it used to be. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe the shop was exactly what it appeared to be, a door to something that was always there, waiting. And now that I've walked through it, I can never fully walk back. The blind woman knew my name because she'd always known it, had been waiting for me to find her, to step through those beads or that door or whatever threshold separates the world we agree on from the one that exists in the corners of our eyes. I've started seeing others like me. We recognize each other on the street, marked by something invisible but unmistakable. We don't speak, but we know. We've all been to shops that shouldn't exist, met people who know things they couldn't know, touched something that left us forever changed. We move through the normal world like ghosts at a feast, present but not quite there, seeing the depths beneath the surface that everyone else desperately pretends don't exist. Sometimes I wonder if the blind woman was trying to warn me or welcome me. Sometimes I wonder if there's even a difference. All I know is that my name sounds different now when people say it, like they're pronouncing it wrong, like the real version exists in a language that human mouths can't quite shape. The frost under my skin has reached my heart. I can feel it beating differently, synced to rhythms that have nothing to do with biology. And sometimes in the mirror, I catch glimpses of milk-white eyes looking back at me, and I understand that blindness and sight are just different ways of seeing the same impossible truth. The shop is still there, of course, not on Royal Street, not in any fixed location, but in the spaces between certainty. And one day, I know, I'll find myself behind that counter, my eyes gone white, waiting for the next person to push through the threshold. I'll know their name before they enter, just as she knew mine, and I'll smile with teeth that are too perfect, too white, and welcome them to something they've always been a part of but never knew existed. Until then, I walk through this almost real world, feeling the edges fray a little more each day, watching the shadows deepen and develop their own intelligence. The blind woman's voice echoes in spaces that shouldn't echo, calling my name in tones that make it sound like a different word entirely, a word that means something in the language of the shop, the language of the dolls, the language of things that watch from jars on shelves that climb towards ceilings that don't exist, and late at night, when the boundary thins to almost nothing, I can feel her cold fingers on my wrist again, and I know that she never really let go. She's still holding on, pulling gently, patiently, inevitably, toward something that might be truth or might be madness or might be both. Because in the shop where the blind woman knows your name, those are all just different words for the same transformation that's been waiting for you since before you were born. Story 7. The company newsletter still sat in my glove compartment, 11 months old and creased from repeated folding. I'd read the article about the incident so many times I could recite it. Tragic accident claims maintenance worker, employee fatally injured when mature oak falls during routine grounds inspection. They'd used his employee photo, the one from his ID badge. He was smiling in it, unaware that he had exactly 14 months left to live. I pulled into the same parking spot he'd used that day. Not by choice. It was the only one available at this hour, tucked beneath the sprawling canopy of oaks that bordered the facility's north entrance. The trees here were ancient, their branches interlocking overhead like arthritic fingers, blocking out most of the security lighting. In daylight, it was merely dim. At night, it was something else entirely. The overtime shift wasn't optional. The server migration had to be completed by morning, and as the sole network administrator stupid enough to live within driving distance, I'd drawn the short straw. The building would be empty except for me and the night security guard, who I'd been told rarely left his booth at the main entrance. As I gathered my laptop bag and thermos of coffee, the first acorn hit my windshield with a crack like a gunshot. I flinched, then laughed at myself. Just an acorn. They fell all the time in autumn. But this was late spring, and the acorns shouldn't have been falling yet. I looked up through the windshield at the branches swaying overhead, though there was no wind. The walk to the building was only 50 yards, but the trees made a tunnel of it. My footsteps echoed oddly, as if the sound was bouncing off surfaces that weren't there. Halfway to the door, something struck my shoulder, hard enough to hurt through my jacket. Another acorn, this one the size of a golf ball. It rolled away into the darkness before I could get a good look at it, but in the brief moment it passed through the security light, I could have sworn it was bleeding. Number. Not bleeding. just wet with sap. Trees leaked sap all the time. The keycard reader beeped, and I pulled the door open, grateful for the fluorescent normalcy of the lobby. The security guard, an older man whose name tag read Devon, barely glanced up from his newspaper. I signed in on the clipboard, 9:47 p.m., and made my way to the server room on the 3rd floor. The building felt different at night. During business hours, it hummed with activity, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the constant murmur of conversation. Now, the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the HVAC system. Each footstep seemed too loud, each breath an intrusion. The server room was my sanctuary, a windowless cube of white noise and blinking lights. I settled in at the workstation, pulled up the migration checklist, and got to work. For the first hour, everything was routine. Files transferred, systems updated, progress bars crawled across screens. I was in my element, lost in the familiar rhythm of keystrokes and command lines. Then I heard it, a scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, coming from somewhere above the drop ceiling. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The server fans hummed. The scratching came again, longer this time, deliberate. Probably just the building settling, or maybe a rodent in the ventilation system. Old buildings made sounds. I'd learned to ignore most of them during my 5 years here, but I'd never heard this particular sound before. Rhythmic, almost like writing. I returned to my work, but concentration was impossible. The scratching continued, sometimes stopping for minutes at a time, then resuming with renewed intensity. I found myself timing the intervals. 3 minutes of silence. Scratch, scratch, scratch. 7 minutes of silence. Scratch, 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 scratch. Was it counting? At 11:30, I needed a break. My eyes burned from staring at screens, and the scratching had evolved into something more complex. A symphony of scrapes and taps that seemed to be coming from multiple directions now. I grabbed my thermos and headed for the break room on the 2nd floor. The hallway lights were on motion sensors, clicking on in sequence as I walked, creating a moving pool of light in an ocean of darkness. Behind me, they clicked off one by one, and I had the distinct feeling that the darkness was following me, maintaining a careful distance. The break room's coffee maker was still on, forgotten by whoever had used it last. A film of burned coffee coated the bottom of the pot. I dumped it in the sink and watched the black liquid swirl down the drain. And that's when I saw the reflection in the microwave door, a shadow moving past the doorway behind me. I spun around. The hallway was empty, lights still on from my recent passage, but they were flickering now, just slightly, creating a strobe effect that made the walls seem to pulse. Back in the server room, I found my migration had encountered an error. Files corrupted, transfers incomplete. 2 hours of work, gone. The error log was filled with gibberish, random characters that formed no recognizable pattern. No, wait. There was a pattern. The characters repeated every 47 lines. The weight of what falls crushes more. I ran the diagnostic tool. The system was fine, no hardware failures, no network issues. I started the migration again, watching the progress bars with growing unease. The scratching above had stopped, replaced by something worse, a creaking, groaning sound, like wood under immense pressure. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Look outside. There were no windows in the server room, but there was one at the end of the hall. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to stay put, to keep my eyes on the screens, to pretend I hadn't seen the message. But I went anyway, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes. The window overlooked the north parking lot, where my car sat alone beneath the trees. Only it wasn't alone anymore. There was someone standing next to it, just outside the pool of security lighting. I couldn't make out details, just a dark figure, perfectly still. As I watched, it raised one arm and pointed up at the trees. The branches were moving, not swaying in wind, but writhing, twisting, reaching down toward my car like grasping hands. One branch, thicker than my arm, was bent at an impossible angle, its tip just inches from my windshield. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The branches hung normally, still and innocent in the windless night. Back in the server room, my migration had failed again. Same error, same corrupted files, same message in the error log. But this time, there was more. The weight of what falls crushes more. He was the first, now the last. Roots drink deep tonight. The temperature in the room had dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs. The servers, which generated enormous heat, continued to run, but their warmth didn't reach me. It was as if I was standing in a pocket of winter. The scratching returned, directly above me now, frantic and aggressive. Dust and small debris fell from the ceiling tiles. One tile shifted, creating a gap of perfect blackness. Something dark dripped through. Not water, too thick for water. It hit the floor with a wet splat, and in the fluorescent light, it looked like sap mixed with something else. Something red. I grabbed my laptop, abandoning the migration. Whatever was happening here, I needed to leave. Now. The hallway lights failed to activate as I ran through them, leaving me to navigate by the emergency exit signs. Behind me, I heard the ceiling tiles falling one by one, each impact echoing through the empty building. The stairwell door wouldn't budge. I pulled my keycard, swiped it again and again. Access denied. The reader's LED glowed red, mocking me. From somewhere above, a sound like splintering wood, like a tree falling in slow motion. The elevator was my only option. I pressed the button, and miraculously, it chimed immediately. The doors slid open to reveal Devon, the security guard, standing in the corner. His newspaper was gone, and his eyes were wrong. Too wide, unblinking, reflecting the emergency lighting like an animal's. He spoke, but his voice was layered, as if multiple people were talking in unison through his mouth. The roots go deep here. They've been drinking for months, ever since the feeding. I backed away, but he didn't follow. The elevator doors closed on his still figure, and the car descended without me. The scratching was all around me now, in the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The building itself seemed to be writing something, a message in a language of splinters and cracks. I ran for the other stairwell, the one on the south side of the building, away from the trees. This door opened. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my laptop bag banging against my hip. 2 floors down, 1 to go. The exit sign glowed like salvation. I burst through the door into the lobby, empty now, Devon's booth abandoned. The main doors were locked. Of course they were. Security protocol. No exit without badge out after 10 p.m. My keycard worked this time, the reader beeping cheerfully. I stumbled into the night, gasping the cool air. But I'd exited on the wrong side. Instead of the main parking lot, I was in the narrow alley between buildings, and the trees were here too. Different trees, but their branches reached across the alley, forming a ceiling of wood and leaves. And they were falling, not the trees themselves, but pieces of them. Branches of all sizes, from twigs to limbs as thick as my thigh, dropping straight down like rain. I ran, dodging and weaving, the impacts creating a percussion symphony around me. A branch grazed my cheek, leaving a burning line of pain. Another struck my shoulder, spinning me around. Through the chaos, I saw him. The employee from the newsletter photo, standing at the end of the alley. But his smile was gone, replaced by an expression of infinite sadness. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the crash of falling wood. Up. The branch was massive, the size of a small tree itself, falling with deliberate slowness. I dove sideways, rolling across the asphalt as it crashed where I'd been standing. The impact shook the ground, and in that moment of stillness that followed, I heard what the dead employee had been trying to tell me. They're hungry. They've always been hungry, and once they taste you, they never forget. I ran. Out of the alley, across the main lot, past my abandoned car still trapped beneath the reaching oaks. I ran until the building was a distant shadow, until the trees were behind me, until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When the sun rose, I was sitting in a 24-hour diner 5 miles away, my laptop bag at my feet, my clothes torn and dirty. The waitress kept refilling my coffee without asking, possibly recognizing shock when she saw it. I called in sick, then quit by email an hour later. No explanation, no notice. Just done. The news report 3 days later was brief. A power outage at the facility, caused by fallen branches damaging the lines. The security guard, Devon, had been found unconscious in his booth, claiming no memory of the night. The server migration had somehow completed itself. All files transferred successfully, though no one could explain how. I've moved since then. Different state, different climate, somewhere with no trees. But sometimes, late at night, I hear scratching in the walls of my apartment. And sometimes, I find acorns on my doorstep, fresh and green, though the nearest oak is 100 miles away. The weight of what falls crushes more than bodies. It crushes certainty, safety, the comfortable belief that the natural world is indifferent to us. But what if it isn't? What if it watches, waits, chooses? What if that employee last year wasn't an accident but an appetizer? I don't know. I can't know. And that's the worst part. Living with the question, forever unanswered, scratching at the inside of my skull like branches against a window, waiting to get in. The laptop I abandoned at the diner that morning contained one final file I'd never created, titled roots.txt. It contained a single line repeated thousands of times. The trees remember. The trees remember. The trees remember. They do. And now, so do I. Story 8. The notification arrived at 2:47 a.m. Its gentle ping somehow louder than any alarm in the darkness of my bedroom. My banking app wanted to verify a login attempt from an unrecognized device. Half asleep, I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the screen through the blur of interrupted dreams. The location showed as local, same city, different IP address. I denied the request and tried to settle back into sleep, but something cold had already begun crawling up my spine. By morning, I'd almost forgotten about it. Almost. But as I stood in line at the coffee shop, waiting for my usual order, I felt eyes on me. Not the casual glance of another customer, but something more deliberate, more focused. I turned slowly, scanning the crowded space, and caught a glimpse of someone quickly looking away. A young man, maybe 25, unremarkable except for the intensity with which he'd been staring. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he buried his face in his phone. The barista called my order. When I turned back from collecting my coffee, the young man was gone. 3 more login attempts came over the next 2 days, each one denied, each one from a slightly different location, but always within a 10-mile radius. I changed my password twice, enabled every security feature the bank offered, even called their fraud department. They assured me my account was secure, that these phishing attempts were common. But common didn't explain the sensation that followed me everywhere. That persistent feeling of being watched, studied, cataloged. On Thursday, I was working from home when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a woman, perhaps in her early 40s, holding what appeared to be a photo album. She looked tired, worn down by something more than just age. Her clothes were neat but dated, as if she'd stepped out of a photograph from 15 years ago. I opened the door but kept the chain latched. The woman smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked if I had a moment to look at something important. Her voice carried an odd quality, like she was reciting lines she'd memorized but didn't quite understand. I told her I wasn't interested in whatever she was selling. She shook her head and said she wasn't selling anything. She just needed me to see. Before I could close the door, she opened the album and held it up to the gap. The photographs inside showed a baby, perhaps 6 months old, with dark hair and bright eyes. Normal baby photos, the kind proud parents share whether you want to see them or not. But something about them made my skin crawl. The baby's eyes seemed to track movement, following me as I shifted my weight from foot to foot. The woman explained that this was her grandchild, that the father had lost access to his accounts. that they just needed help with a temporary transfer to pay for formula and diapers. Her words came faster now, tumbling over each other. She mentioned specific amounts, routing numbers, said she had all the documentation to pay me back within the week. I started to close the door, but she pressed harder against it, the photo album shaking in her grip. The baby's face in the photographs began to blur, or maybe my vision was going strange, because for a moment it looked like the infant's features were shifting, aging, becoming something else entirely. The woman's voice took on a desperate edge as she insisted I just needed to look closer, to really see what she was showing me. I slammed the door shut and turned the deadbolt. Through the peephole, I watched her stand there for another 5 minutes, perfectly still, the album clutched to her chest. Then, as if activated by some invisible signal, she turned and walked away with mechanical precision. That night, the login attempts increased. Every hour, sometimes every few minutes, my phone would light up with another verification request. I turned off notifications, but I could still feel them somehow, each attempt like a finger tapping against my skull. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of that baby's face, morphing and changing, growing older and younger simultaneously, its eyes always watching. The next morning, exhausted and frayed, I decided to visit the bank in person. I needed to close the account, open a new one, do something to end this siege. The branch was nearly empty when I arrived, just one teller and a few customers. I explained my situation to the representative, showed her the dozens of denied login attempts. She nodded sympathetically and began the paperwork for a new account. As she typed, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. The young man from the coffee shop was sitting in the waiting area, pretending to read a brochure about mortgage rates. My chest tightened. The representative noticed my distraction and asked if everything was all right. I turned back to her, trying to keep my voice steady, and said I thought someone was following me. She glanced over at the waiting area, then back at me with a puzzled expression. The waiting area was empty, just empty chairs and scattered financial pamphlets. But I could still feel him there, occupying space that appeared vacant, his presence like a weight in the air. The representative continued with the paperwork, but her fingers moved differently now, each keystroke deliberate and heavy. The sound they made wasn't quite right, too wet, too organic. I watched her hands, and for a moment, they seemed to have too many joints, bending in ways that defied anatomy. I blinked hard, and they were normal again. She smiled and said the new account would be ready in a few minutes, that I should have a seat while she processed everything. I remained standing, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I needed this done. I needed the attempts to stop. The woman with the photo album walked through the bank's front door. She moved directly toward me, that same mechanical walk, the album pressed against her chest. Other customers seemed not to notice her, stepping aside without looking, creating a clear path between us. She stopped 3 feet away and opened the album again. The photographs had changed. They still showed a baby, but now I was in them too, holding the infant, feeding it, playing with it in a park I'd never visited. In each photo, my expression was blank, automatic, like I was sleepwalking through someone else's life. The woman explained that these were memories, that I'd forgotten, that the baby was counting on me to remember my obligations. I backed away, bumping into the representative's desk. She looked up at me with concern, asked if I knew this woman. But when I pointed to where the woman stood, the representative's eyes didn't focus on anything. She looked through the space where the woman existed, seeing nothing but empty air and fluorescent lighting. The woman with the album stepped closer, and to move, the baby's mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. No sound came out, but I could feel words forming in my mind, not heard but somehow received. They spoke of debts owed, of contracts signed in moments I couldn't recall, of obligations that transcended simple banking. I ran, pushed past the invisible woman, past the representative calling after me, out into the harsh daylight. My phone buzzed constantly now. Not just banking notifications, but messages from numbers I didn't recognize, all containing those same baby photos, each one showing me in situations I'd never experienced, holding a child I'd never met. At home, I disconnected from everything. Phone off, router unplugged, every screen in the house powered down. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the pause before a thunderclap. I could feel them still trying to reach me, their attempts creating a pressure in the air, making it thick and difficult to breathe. That night, in the darkness of my bedroom, I heard the soft sound of pages turning. The photo album sat on my nightstand, though I knew I'd never brought it inside. By the moonlight filtering through the blinds, I could see new photographs appearing on its pages, materializing like Polaroids developing in reverse. Each one showed me a little older, a little more worn down, always with that baby who never aged, whose eyes held knowledge no infant should possess. I reached for the album, my hand moving without my conscious control, drawn by something that bypassed my will entirely. As my fingers touched the cover, I felt memories that weren't mine flooding in. Someone else's life, someone else's choices, someone else's debts coming due. The young man's face flickered in my mind, but it was also my face, just younger, before something had been taken from him. The woman was there too, not his mother or grandmother, but something wearing the shape of family, using familiarity as a doorway. The baby in the photographs opened its mouth wider than any infant's mouth should open, and inside was not darkness, but another set of eyes, watching me from within, watching from within, watching from within. I jerked my hand back, the spell broken, but not ended. The album remained on the nightstand, patient and permanent. I knew that tomorrow there would be more login attempts, more visitors with photographs, more fragments of a life I'd never lived pressing against the boundaries of my own existence. The account they wanted access to wasn't just financial. It was something deeper, more fundamental, the ledger of self, the balance of being. I write this now in the pre-dawn hours, my laptop screen the only light in the room. The album has fallen open beside me, its pages turning by themselves, showing me futures that haven't happened yet, or pasts that were erased. I can no longer tell. In every photograph, the baby's eyes follow me, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when I'll finally understand what it means to pay what I owe. The notifications have started again, even with everything disconnected. They appear in the air itself, floating verifications for transactions I never initiated, requests to confirm transfers from accounts that exist outside of any bank. Each one denied, but each denial costs something, a memory, a moment, a small piece of whatever makes me myself. I can hear footsteps in the hallway now, though I live alone. The sound of pages turning grows louder, accompanied by a wet, organic noise like fingers typing on keys made of something other than plastic. They're processing my application, completing the transfer, finalizing the transaction that was always going to complete itself. The woman's voice drifts through the walls, explaining once again that she's not selling anything. She just needs me to see. The young man's presence fills the doorway, visible only as an absence of space, and somewhere, in a photograph that's developing even now, a baby opens its mouth to speak words that will remake everything I thought I knew about debt and payment, about what it means to own anything, especially yourself. The sun is rising now, but the light feels wrong, filtered through something that changes its quality, makes it thick and amber like the fluid in old photographs. Upscreen, but there's someone standing behind me who isn't there when I turn around. Or maybe I'm the one who isn't really there. Maybe I'm the reflection, and something else is sitting at my desk, typing words I never chose, documenting a transaction that was completed long before I ever received that first notification. The album's pages have gone blank now, waiting to be filled with whatever comes next. And despite everything, despite the horror of it all, I find myself reaching for it again, drawn by a curiosity that might not even be my own, because maybe that's how it works. Not through force or fear, but through the simple, terrible need to understand what's happening to us, even when understanding means becoming part of it forever. My phone lights up one more time. This time, I don't deny the request. I don't accept it either. I just sit here, suspended between choices that were never really mine to make, waiting to see which version of myself will sign the final paperwork. and wondering if there was ever really any difference between them at all. The baby in the photographs has started to smile. Story 9. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago, though I suspect it had been happening longer. The shadow at the foot of my bed wasn't behaving like shadows should. It was a Tuesday night, unremarkable except for the oppressive heat that had settled over the town like a wet blanket. I'd kicked off my covers and lay there in just boxers, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy rotation. The streetlight outside cast its usual amber glow through my blinds, creating those familiar striped patterns across my walls. Everything was normal, except for the shadow. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The dark shape at the foot of my bed seemed to be moving, not shifting with the fan's breeze or adjusting to passing car headlights, but melting. Like thick tar in slow motion, it appeared to be dripping down toward the floor, pooling there in a way that defied the physics of light and shadow. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, it was just a normal shadow. Of course it was. Shadows don't melt. But the next night, I saw it again. This time I watched longer, fighting the urge to look away. The shadow definitely moved independently of any light source. It reminded me of those time-lapse videos of ice cream melting, except in reverse, gathering itself, becoming denser, darker. The air in that corner of the room felt different too, heavier somehow, like breathing through wet cloth. By the end of the first week, I'd started leaving all the lights on when I slept. It didn't help. The shadow was still there, still wrong, now visible even against the illuminated wall. That's when I knew this wasn't about lighting or tired eyes. I should have left then, packed my things and crashed at my brother's place across town. But there was something hypnotic about watching it, something that made me need to understand what I was seeing. Each night, I'd lie there for hours, observing its slow, viscous movement. It never did anything else, just that constant, subtle melting motion, like reality itself was liquefying at the foot of my bed. The cemetery incident happened on a Friday. I'd been driving back from a late shift at the warehouse, taking the shortcut past Riverside Cemetery. My headlights swept across the iron gates, illuminating the first rows of headstones. But then the light just stopped. Not like hitting fog or mist, but like the darkness itself was absorbing the beams, swallowing them whole. I slowed the car to a crawl, leaning forward over the steering wheel. Where my high beams should have penetrated at least 50 yards into the cemetery, they simply ended about 10 feet past the fence. The darkness beyond wasn't just absence of light. It was a presence, thick and tangible. Then I saw it. A mass of absolute black, darker than the darkness around it, draped over one of the larger tombstones near the fence. It wasn't a shadow because there was nothing to cast it. It wasn't cloth because it moved without wind. It pulsed slightly, rhythmically, like breathing. I pressed the accelerator, probably harder than I should have, but as I passed the cemetery's main entrance, movement in my peripheral vision made me glance back. 3 figures stood just inside the gates, tall, impossibly tall, and white. Not pale or light-colored, but white like exposed bone, like fresh paper, like nothing that should exist in the darkness. They didn't move as I drove past, but I could feel them watching, feel their attention like cold fingers pressed against the back of my neck. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen with every light on, drinking coffee until my hands shook. But eventually, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off at the table because I woke to find myself back in my bed, in the dark, with no memory of walking there. The shadow at the foot of my bed was larger now, spreading across more of the floor, and it wasn't alone. The darkness from the cemetery had followed me home. I could feel it pressing against my windows, seeping through the cracks under my doors. The air tasted different, metallic and cold, like licking a frozen pole. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The shadow's movements, the time it appeared most active, always between 3 and 4 a.m., the way my electronics would flicker when it grew especially dark. I measured it, photographed it, even tried to touch it once. My hand went numb for 3 days after that mistake. My neighbor mentioned I looked tired, asked if everything was okay. I wanted to tell her about the shadows, about the cemetery, about the tall white things that now stood at the corner of my vision whenever I drove at night. But the words wouldn't come. My throat would close up, and I'd just nod and mumble something about work stress. The breaking point came 2 nights ago. I woke to find the shadow had spread across my entire floor, a black lake of wrongness that seemed to breathe in sync with my own panicked gasps. But worse, reflected in that dark surface, I could see them, the white figures from the cemetery. They stood around my bed like pale sentinels, their faces, if they had faces, turned down toward me. I couldn't see them directly. When I looked up, nothing was there. But in the shadow lake's reflection, they were clear as day, getting closer each time I blinked. One reached down with an arm far too long for any human, its white fingers stretching toward my face. I felt the touch, cold, electric, invasive, despite seeing nothing above me. I ran, grabbed my keys and phone and ran barefoot out of my apartment, down 3 flights of stairs, into my car. I drove without destination until dawn, pulled over at a truck stop 2 towns away and tried to make sense of what was happening to me. The rational part of my brain, the part that still functioned, offered explanations. Stress-induced hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning, a brain tumor pressing on my visual cortex. I even went to the emergency room, let them run tests. Everything came back normal. The doctor suggested anxiety medication and a therapist. But medication doesn't explain why my apartment's new tenant called me yesterday, frantic, saying there was something wrong with the bedroom. It doesn't explain why the cemetery has been closed indefinitely for maintenance, or why 3 other people on my street have suddenly moved without explanation. I'm staying at a motel now, different one each night, but it doesn't matter. The shadow has found me. Right now, as I write this, it's pooling at the foot of this unfamiliar bed, darker and more substantial than ever. The white figures are here too. I can see them in every reflective surface, the TV screen, the bathroom mirror, the window glass. They're waiting for something, patient as stone. I've stopped trying to rationalize it. Whether this is madness or something worse, the result is the same. Reality has developed a leak, and something is seeping through. The boundaries between shadow and substance, between here and somewhere else, are dissolving like that melting darkness at the foot of my bed. I can hear them now, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. They're telling me things, showing me images of places that shouldn't exist. Cities built from shadow, populated by those tall white forms. Streets where darkness flows like water, where the sun is just a memory, where the difference between awake and asleep no longer matters. They want me to understand something, but the knowledge feels too large for my mind, like trying to pour the ocean into a coffee cup. Each night, the shadow grows, and I feel myself growing smaller, less substantial, as if I'm the one melting now, dissolving into something else. The worst part? Part of me wants to let it happen. There's a terrible logic to it, a sense that this is how things are supposed to be, that our world of light and solid objects is the aberration, and the shadow realm pressing through is the true reality trying to correct itself. I've stopped running. Tonight, when the shadow spreads across the floor, when the white figures gather around my bed, I won't close my eyes. I'll watch as the darkness rises, as those pale hands reach down, as the boundary finally dissolves completely. Maybe I'll understand then. Maybe I'll become something that can exist in both worlds. Shadow and light, real and unreal. Or maybe I'll simply cease to be in any way that matters. The shadow is moving faster now, excited perhaps, sensing my surrender. The white figures in the window's reflection are swaying slightly, a hypnotic rhythm that makes my eyelids heavy. The room temperature has dropped at least 20 degrees in the last hour, and I can see my breath misting in the air. I think about calling someone, leaving a final message, but what would I say? That shadows don't behave like they should? That darkness can be hungry? That there are things standing right behind you that you can only see in reflections? Number This knowledge is mine alone to carry, at least for now, though I suspect others will learn soon enough. The shadow at the foot of my bed wasn't the beginning. It was just my introduction. Whatever's happening, it's spreading, growing, melting through the cracks in our ordered little world. I'm tired now, so tired. The melting shadow looks almost comfortable, like a blanket made of night. The white figures are humming something, a sound that bypasses my ears and resonates in my bones. It's not unpleasant. It's almost like coming home. I'll stop writing now. The shadow is at the foot of the bed, patient as always, waiting for me to finally understand what it's been trying to show me all along. The white figures are closer in the reflection, close enough that I can almost make out features that aren't quite faces, expressions that aren't quite human. Tomorrow, if there is a tomorrow, if I'm still capable of writing, I'll add more. But I suspect tomorrow will be different. I suspect I'll be different. The shadow knows. The white things know. And soon, I'll know too. The melting has begun. Story 10. The pull chain clicked against the metal housing of the ceiling fan as I yanked it down, and darkness swallowed my bedroom whole. I'd done this same routine every night for the past 3 months since moving into the apartment. Reach up, pull the chain, settle into bed. But tonight, something was different. The moment darkness fell, I heard it. The slow, deliberate creak of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. My closet door was opening. I froze, my hand still raised toward where the pull chain dangled invisible in the blackness. The sound continued. Not the quick swing of a door caught by a draft, but a measured, purposeful movement. Then came the breathing. Deep, ragged inhalations that seemed to fill the entire room, as if the darkness itself had developed lungs. My fingers fumbled for the chain again, muscle memory guiding me through the pitch black. I pulled once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The light refused to come on. The breathing grew closer, and I could smell something now. Old fabric and mothballs mixed with something organic, like soil after rain. I didn't think. I ran. My shin collided with the edge of my bed frame as I scrambled toward where I knew the bedroom door should be. Pain shot up my leg, but adrenaline carried me forward. My hands found the doorknob, twisted, pulled. I tumbled into the hallway where the overhead light cast everything in harsh fluorescent reality. Behind me, my bedroom remained a rectangle of perfect darkness. I stood there, chest heaving, staring at that dark doorway for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, as if nothing had happened, the bedroom light flickered on. Through the doorway, I could see my ordinary room, rumpled bedsheets, yesterday's clothes on the chair, and the closet door hanging wide open. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't slept in that room since. I tried to rationalize it at first. Old building, faulty wiring, maybe a rat in the walls affecting the electrical system. The closet door? Probably just the building settling, or changes in air pressure from the heating system. The breathing sound could have been pipes, or wind through the ventilation. I had explanations for everything except the feeling, that bone-deep certainty that something had been in there with me, watching from inside that closet. I started sleeping on the couch, told myself it was temporary while I got an electrician to check the wiring. But every night I'd lie there listening to the sounds from my bedroom. Sometimes I heard nothing. Other nights I'd hear that distinctive creak of the closet door, always around the same time I used to turn off the light. During the day I'd force myself to go in there. Everything looked normal. I'd check the closet, just clothes and boxes, nothing unusual. I even replaced the light bulb and tested the pull chain multiple times. It worked perfectly in daylight, but I couldn't bring myself to test it at night. My work started to suffer. Dark circles became permanent fixtures under my eyes. My colleague asked if everything was all right, and I almost told him. Almost explained that I was being held hostage in my own apartment by a closet door and a faulty light switch. The words died in my throat. How could I explain something that sounded insane even to me? 2 weeks into my couch exile, curiosity finally won. I needed to know if I'd imagined it all. Maybe I'd been half asleep that night, caught in some kind of hypnagogic hallucination. Sleep deprivation was getting to me anyway. I was starting to see shadows move in my peripheral vision even during the day. I set up my phone to record, propping it on the dresser with the camera facing the closet. Then, at exactly 10:47 p.m., the same time as that first night, I pulled the chain. The darkness came instantly, complete and suffocating. I stood there, every muscle tense, waiting. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. I started to feel foolish. Then the creak began. This time, I forced myself to stay still, to listen carefully. The door was definitely opening, and the breathing started again, rhythmic, patient, like something savoring the moment. The smell returned too, stronger now, earthy and wrong. My hand found the pull chain and yanked it desperately. Once again, nothing. But this time, I didn't run immediately. I waited, counting my breaths, trying to match them to the thing in my closet. 1, 2, 3, 4. The breathing moved closer. 5, 6, 7. I could feel air displacement, as if something large was moving through the space between us. 8, 9. I ran again, slamming into the doorframe in my haste. From the lit hallway, I watched my bedroom return to normal, the light flickering on as if it had never refused to work. The closet door hung open, mocking me. My hand shook as I retrieved my phone. The video was there, 23 minutes of footage. But when I played it back, the screen showed only darkness. Complete, uninterrupted darkness. The audio was worse, static mostly, but underneath it, if I turned the volume up and listened carefully, I could hear breathing that wasn't mine. I started researching the apartment's history. Nothing dramatic, no murders, no suicides, nothing that would explain what was happening. The previous tenant had lived here for 6 years without incident, according to the landlord. The building itself was only 20 years old, built on land that had previously been a parking lot. No ancient burial grounds, no demolished asylums, nothing. I installed a smart light bulb that I could control from my phone. The first night I tried it, I stood in the hallway and turned off the light remotely. Even from outside the room, I could hear the closet door creak open. When I tried to turn the light back on through the app, my phone showed the bulb as disconnected. I had to physically enter the room and flip the wall switch to get the light back. Sleep deprivation was taking its toll. I'd catch myself standing in front of the bedroom doorway, not remembering how I got there. Once I woke up on the couch to find muddy footprints leading from my bedroom to where I lay. My feet were clean, but the smell, that earth and mothball smell, clung to the air around me. I considered moving out, but my lease had 10 months left, and the penalty would bankrupt me. Besides, a part of me needed to understand what was happening. That part grew stronger as the days passed, fed by insomnia and a creeping obsession. Last night I tried something different. Instead of pulling the chain at 10:47, I sat in the room with the lights on and waited. I watched the closet door, noticed how ordinary it looked. White painted wood, brass hinges, nothing special. At 10:47 exactly, nothing happened. The lights stayed on, the door stayed closed. But at 10:48, the light bulb burned out with a sharp pop. In the darkness that followed, the closet door didn't creak. It slammed open with such force that I felt the air pressure change in the room. The breathing that followed wasn't from inside the closet. It was all around me, surrounding me like I was inside something's mouth. The smell was overwhelming now. Not just earth and mothballs, but something older, like opening a tomb. I couldn't move. Not because I was frozen with fear, but because something was holding me in place. I felt pressure on my shoulders, my chest, keeping me seated on the bed. The breathing synchronized with mine, or maybe mine synchronized with it. I couldn't tell anymore. Then it spoke. Not with words, but with images that appeared in my mind. Flashes of the apartment before I lived here, before anyone lived here. The closet door opening and closing, like breathing. People moving in, people moving out, never staying long. And in every image, something waiting inside that closet. patient and hungry. The pressure released, and I gasped, my own breathing suddenly my own again. The light flickered back on, the bulb that had just burned out now working perfectly. The closet door stood open, and inside, I could see my clothes hanging exactly where I'd left them. But the back wall of the closet looked wrong somehow, like it extended further than it should, disappearing into a darkness that the overhead light couldn't penetrate. I approached slowly, each step deliberate. The closer I got, the more wrong the closet felt. The dimensions were off. It was definitely deeper than it had been this morning. I reached in, past my hanging shirts, toward that back wall that seemed to recede as I moved closer. My hand touched something that wasn't drywall. It was soft, organic, like moss or carpet, but warm, almost body temperature. It pulsed slightly under my fingers. I jerked my hand back, and as I did, the closet snapped back to normal. Ordinary size, ordinary back wall. Nothing but clothes and boxes. I haven't slept since then. It's been 18 hours, and I'm sitting in a coffee shop typing this on my laptop, trying to make sense of what's happening. Every time I close my eyes, I see that darkness extending beyond my closet, feel that warm, pulsing surface under my fingers. The rational part of my brain keeps offering explanations. Stress-induced psychosis, carbon monoxide poisoning, a brain tumor affecting my temporal lobe. I've made a doctor's appointment for tomorrow, though I don't know how to explain any of this without sounding completely unhinged. But the other part of my brain, the part that felt that thing breathing in sync with me, knows that something lives in that closet. Not lives exactly, exists. It's been there longer than the apartment, longer than the building. It's the dark space that exists in every closet, every shadow, every unlit corner. And now it knows I've noticed it. I have to go back eventually. My work clothes are in that bedroom, my laptop charger, everything I need for normal life. The sun is setting now and the coffee shop closes in an hour. I tell myself I'll just grab what I need and leave, sleep in my car if I have to. But I know I'll pull that chain again. I have to, because now that I've felt what's behind that closet wall, I need to know what it wants, why it waits, why it breathes. The rational part of my brain screams that this is how people disappear, how they become just another missing person case. But the other part, the part that's growing stronger with each sleepless hour, whispers that maybe disappearing isn't the worst thing that could happen. Maybe the worst thing is what I'm becoming, someone who stands at the edge of darkness and wants to step inside. The coffee shop is nearly empty now. The barista keeps glancing at me, probably wondering why I've been sitting here all day with the same cold coffee. My phone shows 3 missed calls from my landlord. Apparently my neighbor complained about strange noises from my apartment last night. Doors slamming and something they described as breathing in the walls. I should be terrified by that. I should pack my car and drive to another city. Lease penalty be damned. Instead, I'm thinking about tonight, about 10:47 p.m., about pulling that chain and not running this time, about reaching deeper into that closet, past where the back wall should be, into whatever space exists beyond. The thing is, I've started to hear the breathing even here in the coffee shop, faint but unmistakable. It's followed me, or maybe I've carried it with me. When I look at shadows now, they seem deeper than they should be, like doorways to that same dark space behind my closet wall. My doctor's appointment is tomorrow at 2 p.m. I've already decided I won't go. By tomorrow at 2 p.m., I'll either have answers or I'll be beyond needing them. Tonight, when I pull that chain and the darkness comes, I won't run. I won't even try to turn the light back on. I'll walk to that closet, reach into that impossible space, and finally understand what's been waiting for me. The barista's walking over now, keys in hand. Closing time. I gather my things slowly, my body heavy with exhaustion and anticipation. Outside, the streetlights flicker on one by one, pushing back the darkness. But I know better now. The darkness doesn't get pushed back. It just retreats, waiting. It's always been waiting. My apartment building looms ahead, windows glowing with warm light. All except one. My bedroom window is dark, and even from the street I can see the closet door hanging open. It's 10:15 p.m. 32 minutes until I pull that chain. 32 minutes until I stop running. I climb the stairs to my floor, each step echoing in the empty stairwell. The breathing is louder now, not just in my head but in the air around me. My neighbor's door is shut tight, no sound from within. The hallway stretches before me, longer than it should be. My apartment door at the far end looking smaller, more distant. I turn my key in the lock, push the door open. The living room is exactly as I left it. Couch cushions disheveled from my restless attempts at sleep. Coffee table covered in research about the building's history. But through the bedroom doorway, I can see that wrong darkness, that absence of light that feels alive. 10:21 p.m. I sit on my couch and wait, watching the bedroom doorway. The breathing is everywhere now, in the walls, in the air, in my own chest. We're synchronized, the apartment and I, bound by this nightly ritual. At 10:30, I stand and walk to the bedroom threshold. The darkness inside seems to pulse, welcoming. I can barely make out the pull chain, a thin line catching what little light spills in from the hallway. The closet door is already open, waiting. 10:45, 2 minutes. I step inside the room, and the temperature drops immediately. My breath fogs in the air, but the darkness swallows even that. I position myself by the fan, hand raised to the chain. 10:46. The breathing stops. Complete silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. Even my heartbeat seems muted. 10:47. I pull the chain. Story 11. And the lightning struck so close I could taste copper in my mouth, and for a moment, the entire ridge of Shivano Peak lit up like a photograph negative, white rock against black sky, my father's silhouette frozen mid-stride ahead of me. Then darkness swallowed us again, and the thunder that followed seemed to come from inside my chest, rattling my ribs like prison bars. We'd been descending for 3 hours since search and rescue radioed us through the static. Get off the ridge. Find the valley. Follow any water down. Simple instructions that became impossible when the fog rolled in thick as wet wool, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet, maybe less. The rain hammered against my jacket with the intensity of thrown gravel, each drop finding its way through sealed seams and waterproof zippers, pooling in my boots until every step squelched. My father moved like a ghost ahead of me, appearing and disappearing in the shifting veils of mist. Sometimes I'd lose sight of him completely, and panic would claw up my throat until his red jacket materialized again, always somehow further away than I expected. The trail, if we were even still on a trail, had become a river of loose scree and mud that slid away beneath our feet with every step. The altitude made thinking feel like swimming through syrup. We'd summited Shivano that morning under clear skies, crossed the saddle to bag Tabaguach as well. 2 14ers in one day, we'd celebrated at the top with lukewarm coffee from my thermos. That felt like weeks ago now. The storm had materialized from nowhere while we were descending Tabaguachi's north face, catching us exposed above tree line with nowhere to shelter. Another flash of lightning illuminated the mountainside, and in that split second of clarity, I saw something that made my blood crystallize. The rocks ahead didn't look right. They were arranged too deliberately, forming patterns that hurt to perceive. Circles within circles, spirals that seemed to turn inward forever. When darkness returned, the image burned behind my eyelids like a brand. My father had stopped. I nearly walked into him, catching myself at the last second. He stood perfectly still, head cocked to one side as if listening. The rain drummed against our hoods. The wind howled through invisible rocks. But beneath it all, I heard what had frozen him in place. A low humming, almost musical, coming from somewhere in the fog below us. He turned to me, and even in the darkness I could see how wide his eyes had become. His lips moved, but the storm swallowed his words. He grabbed my arm, fingers digging in hard enough to hurt through my jacket, and pulled me sideways off whatever path we'd been following. We scrambled over wet boulders, slipping and sliding, the humming growing louder behind us. Or was it ahead? The fog distorted everything, made direction meaningless. We found a shallow overhang, barely enough to crouch under, and pressed ourselves against the cold rock. My father's breath came in sharp gasps that fogged in the frigid air. The temperature had plummeted with the storm. It had to be near freezing now. Ice crystals formed on my eyelashes. My gloves had soaked through, and I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. The humming passed by us, so close I swear I felt the air vibrate. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't quite inhuman either. It existed in some uncanny valley of sound that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. As it faded into the distance, my father whispered something that the wind almost stole. "That's not possible." Before I could ask what he meant, he was moving again, practically running now despite the treacherous footing. I stumbled after him, my headlamp beam bouncing uselessly in the fog, illuminating nothing but gray upon gray upon gray. The world had shrunk to just us and maybe 20 feet of mountainside that constantly shifted and changed as we moved through it. Time became elastic. We might have been descending for minutes or hours. I couldn't tell anymore. My watch had stopped working, the digital display showing nothing but 8888. The altimeter on my GPS spun wildly, claiming we were at 17,000 feet, then sea level, then negative numbers that shouldn't exist. I shoved it back in my pocket and focused on keeping my father's red jacket in sight. The rocks around us began to change. At first I thought exhaustion was playing tricks on my eyes, but no. They really were different. Too smooth in places, with angles that seemed wrong somehow, as if they'd been carved rather than weathered. Some bore markings that might have been natural striations, except they formed patterns too regular, too intentional. When lightning flashed again, I glimpsed symbols that reminded me of something I'd seen before but couldn't quite place. Something that made my stomach turn with inexplicable dread. My father stopped so abruptly I slammed into his back. He stood at the edge of what looked like a cliff, though the fog made it impossible to see how far it dropped. But that wasn't what had halted him. There were footprints in the mud at his feet, fresh ones, heading along the cliff edge. They looked exactly like our boot prints, down to the distinctive wear pattern on my father's left heel, where he'd patched a hole with duct tape. He looked at me, then at the prints, then back at me. His face had gone pale beneath his hood. Without a word, he turned and followed the footprints. What else could we do? They led somewhere, and somewhere was better than nowhere in this white-gray hell. The path narrowed until we were sidling along with our backs pressed to the rock face, the invisible drop yawning beside us. The footprints continued, impossible and undeniable. Then they stopped, not at an obstacle or a turn. They just ended, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. My father stood staring at the last print for a long moment. When he looked back at me, his expression had changed. There was something wild in his eyes, a recognition of something I didn't understand. He opened his mouth, closed it, then pointed ahead where the path widened again. We kept moving, but something fundamental had shifted. The fog seemed thicker now, almost solid, pressing against us with intent. And the sounds, the storm was still raging, but underneath it, I heard other things. Whispers that might have been wind through rocks, footsteps that might have been falling stones. That humming again, but from multiple directions now, creating harmonics that made my skull ache. A shape loomed out of the fog, a cairn, those stacked rock markers that show the trail. But this one was wrong. Too tall, too precisely balanced. The stones fitted together without gaps like some ancient construction. As we passed it, I could have sworn the rocks shifted slightly, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. More cairns appeared, each more elaborate than the last, forming a path that led steadily downward. My father followed them without hesitation, but I saw how his hands shook, how he kept glancing back over his shoulder at something I couldn't see, or didn't want to see. The temperature dropped further. Our breath came out in clouds that hung in the still air longer than they should have. Frost formed on the rocks around us in patterns that spiraled and branched like frozen fractals. When I touched one, the ice was warm. Then we heard voices, clear as day, coming from somewhere below us. Search and rescue it had to be. My father called out, his voice cracking with relief. The voices called back, but the words were wrong. They were speaking English, but the syntax was off, the rhythm all wrong. like someone had learned the language from a book but never heard it spoken. My father grabbed my arm again, stopping me from responding. We stood frozen, listening as the voices came closer. They were using our names. They knew our names. But how? We hadn't given them to SAR, hadn't had time before the radio cut out. The fog parted for just a moment, and I saw them. Two figures in red jackets, moving up the slope toward us. They moved exactly like us, same gait, same slight favor of the left leg I'd developed from an old skiing injury. Because they were us. I was looking at myself and my father, climbing up the mountain we were descending. The other me looked up and our eyes met across maybe 50 feet of impossible space. I smiled, but it was wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth. Then the fog closed again, and they were gone. My father was pulling me, running now, skidding and sliding down the loose scree. Behind us, those voices called our names again, but they sounded different now. Hungry, eager, like predators who'd caught a scent. We ran blindly through the white nothing, following paths that shouldn't exist, past cairns that rebuilt themselves in our peripheral vision, through a landscape that folded and unfolded in ways that made my eyes water to perceive. The ground leveled out. Trees materialized from the fog. We'd made it below tree line, but the trees were wrong too. They grew in perfect spirals, their branches forming geometric patterns that repeated at every scale. The bark was smooth as glass, and when lightning flashed I could see through them like they were made of ice or crystal. My father stopped running. We stood gasping in a clearing where the fog was thinner, though still present. He pulled out his GPS with trembling hands. It was working again, showing our position clearly. We were exactly where we'd started that morning, at the trailhead parking lot, but there were no cars, no trail signs, no evidence that humans had ever been here except for us. He looked at me then, really looked at me, studying my face like he was trying to memorize it or make sure I was really me. His hand reached out slowly, hesitantly, and touched my cheek. His fingers were ice cold but solid, real. "We need to keep moving," he whispered. But I heard the doubt in his voice. Moving where? Everything looked the same in every direction. Those impossible trees stretching into the fog, that low humming coming from everywhere and nowhere. We picked a direction and walked. Time meant nothing anymore. The sun should have set, but the light never changed. Just that constant gray twilight filtering through the fog. We didn't get hungry or thirsty, didn't get more tired despite walking for what felt like hours. The landscape repeated and folded back on itself. The same clearing from different angles. The same fallen tree that was somehow fallen in different directions each time we passed it. And always, just at the edge of perception, those other versions of us. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes to the side. Always moving in paths that paralleled, but never quite intersected ours. Once I saw myself standing still, watching me walk by. Another time, my father saw himself lying on the ground, but when he ran to help, the body was gone. The humming grew louder, more complex, until I realized it wasn't external at all. It was coming from inside my skull, resonating in my bones. My father heard it too. I could tell by the way he pressed his palms against his ears, trying to block out something that couldn't be blocked. Then suddenly, it all stopped. The fog lifted like a curtain. We stood on a normal forest trail, the late afternoon sun slanting through normal pine trees. Below us, we could see the parking lot with our car sitting exactly where we'd left it. Other vehicles were there too, including a search and rescue truck. We stumbled down the trail, our legs shaking with exhaustion that had suddenly returned full force. The SAR team was packing up their gear. They looked surprised to see us. "Where did you guys come from?" one asked. "We've been searching for 6 hours. The storm passed through this morning, but you never came down." My father and I exchanged glances. 6 hours? We'd been gone for... I couldn't remember. Time still felt slippery, uncertain. They checked us over, found us hypothermic and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. They said we were lucky, that people had died in storms like that on those peaks. They said the mountains could play tricks on your mind when you're exhausted and oxygen deprived. They said a lot of things that should have been reassuring, but as we sat in the back of the ambulance, warming up with blankets and hot coffee, I saw my father staring at the mountain, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was, about those footprints that matched ours exactly, about those other versions of ourselves, about the humming that still echoed faintly in our bones. The paramedic was asking me questions, checking for signs of altitude sickness or confusion. I answered on autopilot, but I kept glancing at my reflection in the ambulance window. It looked like me, moved when I moved. But sometimes, just for a fraction of a second, I swear it smiled when I didn't. We never talked about it afterward. What was there to say? That we'd slipped between worlds. That the mountain had shown us something our minds weren't equipped to process. That we'd left something up there, or brought something back, or both. But sometimes, during storms, I hear that humming again, and sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I see someone in a red jacket who moves exactly like my father, walking through places my father has never been. And sometimes, when I look in mirrors, I see myself looking back from angles that shouldn't be possible, with expressions I never made. The mountain gave us back, but I'm no longer certain it gave back exactly what it took. Or maybe it gave back more than it took. Or maybe, and this is the thought that wakes me at 3 a.m., heart pounding, maybe we never left at all, and somewhere up in that fog, the real us is still wandering, still searching for a way down that doesn't exist, while these other versions live our lives in a world that's almost, but not quite, the one we started in. I still hike, but I never go above tree line anymore. And I never, ever hike Shivano or Tabaguache, because sometimes, on clear days, when I look up at those peaks, I swear I can see two tiny figures in red jackets, still climbing, still searching, still lost in a storm that ended months ago, but somehow never stops. Story 12. The static came first. Not the harsh white noise static that old televisions make when they lose signal, but something softer, almost organic, like whispers filtered through cotton and distance. I'd been sorting through my late uncle's estate for 3 days when I found it in the basement. A 1987 Zenith Space Command, wood-paneled sides darkened with age, screen curved like a fisheye lens. The thing must have weighed 80 pounds. I should have left it there, but something about finding that ancient television set, tucked behind stacks of moldering National Geographic magazines and Christmas decorations from the Carter administration, felt like discovering a message in a bottle. My uncle had been peculiar, not dangerous, just odd in that way bachelors get when they live alone too long. He'd died watching television, the neighbors said. Natural causes. Heart gave out at 73. The movers had already taken everything worth selling. I was just there to clean out the remnants, prep the house for sale. Setting up the old TV in the empty living room seemed harmless enough. The cable was already disconnected, but I was curious if the thing even worked. The power cord looked intact, no fraying. I plugged it in. The screen bloomed to life with that familiar high-pitched whine that only people over 30 can still hear. That mosquito frequency that modern flat screens never make. But instead of static or darkness, the screen showed nothing, not black, not white, a kind of gray-green phosphorescence that seemed to breathe. Then the first message appeared. You're tired. White letters, center screen. No channel identification, no logo. The font looked wrong somehow, too clean for such an old set. Each letter perfectly formed, as if painted by hand rather than transmitted. I was tired. 3 days of sorting through someone else's life will do that. But the coincidence made my skin prickle. I pressed the channel button. Nothing changed. Volume up, volume down. The message remained. Then it vanished, replaced by that breathing gray-green glow. I unplugged the TV and went back to packing boxes. That night I couldn't stop thinking about it. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty. My girlfriend was traveling for work. Wouldn't be back for another week. Just me, leftover Chinese food, and the persistent feeling that I'd forgotten something important. At 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and drove back to my uncle's house. The TV was still there, of course, still unplugged. I connected it again, and this time the screen showed actual static. Beautiful, chaotic, normal static. I felt ridiculous. Exhausted middle-aged man spooked by coincidence. I was about to unplug it again when the static cleared. She won't answer. My phone rang. Not immediately. Maybe 30 seconds.